Chapter 28 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 28, The Moonlit River. Betty Winter was quick to answer the hurry call for more nurses in the field hospital at Chancellorsville. The result at the end of 3 days' carnage had paralyzed the service. She left the Carver Hospital on receipt of the first cry for help and hurried to her home to complete her preparations to leave for the front. Her father was at breakfast alone. She called her greeting from the hall, rushed to her room, packed a bag, and quickly came down. She slipped her arm around his neck, bent, and kissed him goodbye. He held her a moment. "You must leave so early, dear." "I must catch the first boat for Aquia. The news from the front is hideous. The force there is utterly inadequate. They've asked for every nurse that can be spared for a week. The wounded lay on the ground for 3 days and nights, and hundreds of them can't be moved to Washington. The woods took fire dozens of times, and many of the poor boys were terribly burned. The suffering, they say, is indescribable." The old man suddenly rose, with a fierce light flashing in his eyes. "Oh, the miserable blunderer in the White House. This war has been one grim and awful succession of his mistakes." Betty placed her hand on his arm in tender protest. "Father, dear, how can you be so unreasonable, so insanely unjust? Your hatred of the president is a positive mania." "I'm not alone in my affliction, child. Arnold is his only friend in Congress today." "Then it's a shame, a disgrace to the nation. Every disaster is laid at his door. In his big heart he is carrying the burden of millions, their sufferings, sorrows, their despair. You blamed him at first for trifling with the war. Now you blame him for the bloody results when the army really fights. You asked for an effective campaign, and when you get these tragic battles, you heap on his head the greater curses. It isn't right, and it isn't fair. I can't understand how a man with your deep sense of justice can be so cruelly inconsistent." The senator shook his gray head in protest. There, dear, we won't discuss it. You're a woman, and you can't understand my point of view. We'll just agree to disagree. You like the man in the White House. God knows he's lonely. I shouldn't begrudge him that little consolation. His whole attitude in this war is loathsome to me. To him the Southerners are erring brethren, to be brought back as prodigal sons in the end. To me, they are criminal outlaws, to be hanged and quartered, their property confiscated, the foundations of their society destroyed, and every trace of their states blotted from the map. Father, until we understand that such is the purpose of the war, we can get nowhere, accomplish nothing. But there, dear, I didn't mean to say so much. There's always one thing about which there can be no dispute. I love my little girl." He slipped his arm around her tenderly again. "I'm proud of the work you're doing for us soldiers. They tell me in the big hospital that you're an angel. I've always known it. But I'm glad other people are beginning to find it out. In all the horrors of this tragedy, there's one ray of sunshine for me, the light that shines from your eyes." He bent and kissed her again. "Run now, and don't miss your boat." In the 5 swift days of tender service which followed, Betty Winter forgot her own heartache and loneliness in the pity, pathos, and horror of the scenes she witnessed. The drawn white faces, the charred flesh, the scream of pain from the young, the sigh of brave men, the last messages of love, the gasp and the solemn silences of eternity. When the strain of the first rush had ended and the time to follow the lines of ambulances back to Washington drew near, the old anguish returned to torture her soul. She told herself it was all over, and yet she knew that somewhere in that vast city of tents, stretching for miles over the hills and valleys about Falmouth Heights, was John Vaughan. She had put him resolutely out of her life. She said this 100 times, yet she was quietly rejoicing that his name was not on that black roll of 17,000. All doubt had been removed by the announcement in the Republican of his promotion to the rank of captain for gallantry on the field of Chancellorsville. She hoped that he had freed himself at last from evil associates. She couldn't be sure. There were ugly rumors flying about the hospital of the use of whiskey in the army. The rumors were particularly busy with Hooker's name. Seated alone, in the quiet moonlight before the field hospital, the balmy air of the South, which she drew in deep breaths, was bringing back the memory of another now. The pickets had been at their usual friendly tricks of trading tobacco and coffee and exchanging newspapers. From a Richmond paper she had just learned that Ned Vaughn had fought in Lee's army at Chancellorsville. Somewhere beyond the silver mirror of the Rappahannock, he was with the men in gray tonight. Her heart, in its loneliness, went out to him in a wave of tender sympathy. Again she lived over the tragic hours when she had fought the battle for his life and won at last the risk of her own. A soldier saluted and handed her a piece of brown wrapping paper, neatly folded. Its corner was turned down in the old-fashioned way of a schoolboy's note to his sweetheart. She went to the light and saw with a start it was in Ned Vaughn's handwriting. She read with eager, sparkling eyes, "Dearest, I've just seen in a Washington paper, which our boys traded for, that you're here. I must see you, and tonight. I can't wait. There will be no danger to either of us. Our pickets are on friendly terms. I've arranged everything with some good tobacco for your fellows. Follow the man who hands you this note to the river. A boat will be ready for you there with one of my men to row you across. I will be waiting for you at the old mill beside the burned pier of the railroad bridge. Signed, Ned." Betty's heart gave a bound of joy, and in half an hour she was standing on the shining shore of the river before the old mill. Its great wheel was slowly turning, the water falling in broken crystal sparkling in the moonlight. Through the windows of the brick walls peered the black-mouthed guns trained across the water. She looked about timidly for a moment when the man in gray, who had rowed her over, made fast his boat. He tipped his old slouch hat. "This way, miss." He led her down close to the big wheel across the stream of water which poured from its moss-covered buckets. And there, beneath an apple tree in a bloom, stood a straight, soldierly figure in the full blue uniform of a federal captain, exactly as she had seen Ned Vaughn that night in the old Capitol prison. The soldier saluted, and Ned said, "Wait, Sergeant, at the water's edge with your boat." He was gone, and Ned grasped both Betty's hands and kissed them tenderly. "My glorious little heroine, I just had to tell you again that the life you saved is all yours. You are glad to see me, aren't you?" "I can't tell you how glad, boy. How brown and well you look. Yes, the hard life somehow agrees with me. It's a queer thing, this army business. It makes some men strong and clean and others into beasts." "And why do you wear that dangerous uniform, sir?" she asked with a smile. "In honor of a beautiful Yankee girl, my guest. I've not worn it since that night, Betty, until now." His voice dropped to a whisper. "It has been a holy thing to me, this blue uniform that cost me the life which you gave back to me at the risk of your own. I was in no danger. I had powerful friends. They might not have been powerful enough, but it's sacred for another reason, as precious to me as the seamless road for which the Roman soldiers cast lots on Calvary. I wore it in the one glorious moment in which I held you in my arms, dearest." "Oh, Ned, boy, you shouldn't be so foolish." "Not sensible. I've done no more scout work since. I said that my life was yours, and I had no right to place it again in such mad danger." "And so you faced death on the field?" "Yes. Come, sit here, dearest. I've made a seat for you of the broken timbers from the bridge. We can see the moonlit river and the lazy turns of the old wheel while we talk." He had led her to the deep seat in the edge of the moonlight, and Betty drew a deep breath of joy as she drank in the beauty of the entrancing scene. The shadows of night had hidden the scars of war. Only the tall stone piers, standing lone sentinels in the river, marked its ravages where the bridge had fallen. The moon had flung her sparkling silver veil over the blood-stained world. "You know," Ned went on eagerly, "those big pillars won't stand there naked long. We'll put the timbers back on them as soon and run our trains through to Washington." "Shh, Ned," Betty whispered, touching his arm lightly. "Be still a moment. I want to feel this wonderful scene." The air was sweet with the perfume of apple blossoms. The water from the old wheel fell with silvery echo and ran rippling over the stones in the river. Somewhere above the cliff, a Negro was playing a banjo, and far down the river beside a little cottage torn with shot and shell, but still standing, a mockingbird was singing in the lilac bushes. The girl looked at Ned with curious tenderness, and wondered if she had known her own heart after all, wondered if the fierce, blinding passion she had once felt for his brother had been the divine thing that links the soul to the eternal. A strange spiritual beauty enveloped this younger man and drew her tonight with new power. There was something restful in its mystery. She wondered vaguely if it were possible to love two men at the same moment. She could almost swear it were, if she had never really loved John Vaughan at all. Why had his terrible, brutal personality drawn her with such terrible power? Was it such a force, love? It was something different from the tender charm which enveloped the slender, straight young figure by her side now. She felt this with increasing certainty. Ned took her hand and kissed the tips of her finger. The touch of his lips sent a thrill through her heart. It was sweet to be worshipped in this old-fashioned, foolish way. Whatever her own feelings might be, this was love in its divinest flowering. It drew her tonight with all but resistless tug. "May I break the silence now, dearest, ask you something?" he asked softly. "Yes." "Haven't you realized yet that you're going to be mine?" "Not in the way you mean, but you are, dearest, you are." He whispered rapturously. "You love me, you just haven't really faced the thing yet and put it to the test in your heart. War has separated us, that's all. But there's never been a moment's doubt in my soul since I looked into your eyes that night in the old prison. Their light made the cell shine with the glory of heaven. And when you kissed me, dearest—" "You know why I did that, Ned," she murmured. "You're fooling yourself, darling. You couldn't have done what you did if you hadn't loved me. It came to me in a flash as I held you in my arms and pressed you to my heart. There can be no other woman on earth. For me, after that moment, I lived a lifetime with it. Say you'll be mine, dearest." "But I don't love you, Ned, as you love me." "I don't ask it now. I can wait. The revelation will come to you at last in the fullness of time. Promise me, dearest. Promise me." For an hour he poured into her ears his passionate, tender plea until the rapture of his love, the perfumed air of the spring night, and the shimmer of the moonlit waters stole her into her lonely heart with resistless charm. She lifted her lips to his at last and whispered, "Yes." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 29, The Panic. The morning after Betty returned to Carver Hospital from the front, a mother was pouring out her heart in a burst of patriotic joy over a wounded boy. She thought of the lonely figure in the White House, treading the winepress of the nation's sorrow alone, and asked the mother to go with her to the president, meet him, and repeat what she had said. She consented at once. For the first time, Betty failed to gain admission promptly. Mr. Stoddard, his third secretary, was at the door. "We must let him eat something, Miss Winter," he whispered. All night the muffled sound of his footfall came from his room. I heard it at 9, at 10, at 11. At midnight Stanton left his door ajar, and his steady tramp, tramp, tramp came with heavier sound. The last thing I heard as I left at 3 was the muffled beat upstairs. The guard told me it had never stopped for a moment all night. Betty was surprised to see his face illuminated by a cheerful smile as she entered. She gazed with awe into the deep eyes of a man whose single word could stop the war and divide the Union. She wondered if he had fought the nation's battle alone with God through the night until his prophetic vision had seen through cloud and darkness the dawn of a new and more wonderful life. She spoke softly. "I've brought you a good mother who lost a son at Fredericksburg. She has a message for you." The tall form bent reverently and pressed her hand. A wonderful smile transfigured his rugged face as he listened. "God help you in your trials, Mr. President, as he has helped me in mine." "And you lost your son at Fredericksburg?" "Yes, it was long before I could feel reconciled, but I've been praying for you day and night since." "For me?" "You must be strong and courageous, and God will bring the nation through." "You say that to me, standing beside the grave of your own son?" "Yes, and beside the cot of my other boy, who's here wounded from Chancellorsville. I'm proud that God gave me such sons to lay on the altar of my country. Remember, I am praying for you day and night." Both big hands closed over hers, and he was silent a moment. "It's all right, then. I'll get new strength when I remember that such mothers are praying for me. He pressed Betty's hand at the door. Thank you, child. You bring medicine that reaches soul and body. The hour of despair had passed, and the president returned to his task, patient, watchful, and strong. Daily the shadows deepened over the nation's life. Blacker and denser rose the clouds. 4 Northern generals had gone down before Lee's apparent invincible genius: McClellan, Pope, Burnside, and Hooker. And with each fall, the corpses of young men were piled higher. Again the clamor rose for the return of McClellan to command. The cry was not only heard in the crushed Army of the Potomac, it was backed by the voice of 2 million Democrats who had chosen the man on horseback as their leader. It was for precisely this reason that McClellan could not be considered again for command. His party had fallen under the complete control of the Copperhead leaders, who demanded the ending of the war at once and at any sacrifice of principle or of the Union. The only way the president could stop desertions and prevent the actual secession of the great northern states of the Middle West, now under the control of these men, was to use arbitrary power to suspend the civil law and put them in prison. Through the State and War Departments, he did this sorrowfully but promptly. His answer to his critics was the soundest reasoning, and it justified him in the judgment of thinking men. I make such arrests, he declared, because these men are laboring to prevent the raising of troops and encouraging desertion. Armies cannot be maintained unless desertion shall be punished by the penalty of death. I will not shoot a simple-minded soldier boy who deserts, and refuse to touch a wily agitator who induces him to commit the crime. To silence the agitator and save the boy is not only constitutional, but withal a great mercy. Volunteers were no longer to be had, and a draft of 500,000 men had been ordered for the summer. The Democratic leaders in solid array were threatening to resist this draft by every means in their power, even to riot and revolution. The masses of the North were profoundly discouraged at the unhappy results of the war. In thousands of patriotic, loyal homes, men and women had begun to ask themselves whether it were not cruel folly to send their brave boys to be slaughtered. The prestige of the Southern Army was at its highest point, and its terrible power was no more gravely realized than in the North, whose thousands of mourning homes attested its valor. Europe at last seemed ready to spring on the throat of America. Distinct reports were in circulation in the Old World that the Emperor of France, Napoleon III, intended to interfere in our affairs. On the 9th of January, the French government denied this. The Emperor himself, however, sent to the President an offer of mediation so blunt and surprising it could not be doubted that it was a veiled hint of his purpose to intervene. Beyond a doubt, he expected the Union to be dismembered, and he proposed to form an alliance between the Latin Empire, which he was founding in Mexico, and the triumphant Confederate States. Great Britain was behind this Napoleonic adventure. Outwitted by the President in the affairs of the Trent, the British government was eager for the chance to strike the Republic. To cap the climax of disasters, Lee was preparing to invade the North with his victorious army. The announcement struck terror to the northern cities and produced a condition among them little short of panic. The move would be the height of audacity, and yet Lee had good reasons for believing its success possible and probable. His gray veterans were still ragged and poorly shod. With southern ports blockaded and no manufacturing, this was inevitable, but they had proven in 2 years tests of fire of Lee's proud boast. There never were such men in an army before. They will go anywhere and do anything if properly led. This opinion was confirmed to the President by Charles Francis Adams, a veteran of his own Army of the Potomac, whom he summoned to the White House for a conference. I do not believe, said Adams gravely, that any more formidable or better organized and animated force was ever set in motion than that which Lee is now leading towards the North. It is essentially an army of fighters, men who individually or in the mass can be depended on for any feat of arms in the power of mere mortals to accomplish. They will blanch at no danger. Lee knows this from experience, and they have full confidence in him. He could not hope to enter Pennsylvania with more than 65,000 men, but his plan was reasonable. With such an army, he had hurled McClellan's 110,000 soldiers back from the gates of Richmond and scattered them to the winds. With a less number, he had all but annihilated Pope's men and flung them back to Washington with a disorganized rabble. With 37,000 gray soldiers, he had repelled in a welter of blood McClellan's 86,000 at Antietam and retired at leisure. With 70,000 men, he had crushed Burnside's host of 113,000 at Fredericksburg. With 60,000, he had just struck Hooker's grand army of 130,000 men and 438 guns, rolled it up as if it were a scroll, and threw it across the Rappahannock in blinding, bewildering defeat. From every prisoner taken at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, he knew that the Northern army was discouraged and heartsick, that he could march his ragged men, the flower of Southern manhood, into Pennsylvania and clothe and feed them on her boundless resources, he couldn't doubt. Virginia was swept bare, and the demoralization of Hooker's army with the profound depression of the North left his way open. To say that Lee's invasion, as it rapidly developed under such conditions, struck terror to the capital of the Republic is to mildly express it. The movement of his army from Culpeper in June indicated clearly that his objective point was Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. If the capital of the state fell, nothing could withstand the onward triumphant rush of his army into Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington. To meet the extraordinary danger, the President called for 100,000 militia for 6 months' emergency service from the 5 states clustering around Pennsylvania. And yet, as the two armies drew near to each other, General George Meade, the new Union commander who had succeeded Hooker, had but 105,000 against Lee's 62,000. So terrible had been the depression following Chancellorsville, so rapid the desertion, so numerous the leaves of absence, that the combined forces of the Army of the Potomac with the state troops under the new call reached only this pitiful total. Lee's swift column penetrated almost to the gates of Harrisburg before Meade's advanced division, 25,000 men, caught up with his rear at Gettysburg on July 1st. Seeing that a battle was inevitable, Lee drew his advance lines and made ready for the clash. The Northern Army was going into this fight with the smallest number of men, relatively, which he had ever met, though outnumbering him nearly 2-1. The difference was that here the North was defending her own soil. It was not surprising that on the eve of such a battle, in the light of the frightful experiences of the past 2 years, that Washington should be in a condition of panic. A single defeat now with Lee's victorious army north of the capital meant its fall, the inevitable dismemberment of the Union, and the bankruptcy and ruin of the remaining northern states. Brave men in Congress who had fought heroically with their mouths, inveighing with bitter invective against the weak and vacillating policy of the President and temporizing with the South, were busy packing their goods and chattels to fly at a moment's notice. The President realized, as no other man could, the deep tragedy of the crisis. He sat by his window for hours, his face a gray mask, his sorrowful eyes turned within, the deep-cut lines furrowed into his cheeks as though burned with red-hot irons. He was struggling desperately now to forestall the possible panic which would follow defeat. He had sent once more for McClellan, and in painful silence, all others excluded from the executive chamber, awaited his coming. "You are doubtless aware, General," the President began, "that a defeat at Gettysburg might involve the fall of the capital and the dismemberment of the Union." "I am, sir." "First, I wish to speak with you with perfect frankness about some ugly matters which have come to my ears. May I?" The compelling blue eyes flashed, and the General spoke with an accent of impatience. "Certainly. A number of secret societies have overspread the North and Northwest, whose purpose is to end the war at once and on any terms. I have the best of reason for believing that the men of these orders are now in touch with the Davis government in Richmond. I am informed that a co-chair of these conspirators, a sort of governing board, has gotten control, or may get control, of the organization of your party. I have heard the ugly rumor that they are counting on you." "Stop," McClellan said. The General sprang to his feet, and the President rose, and the two men confronted each other in a moment of tense silence. The compact figure of McClellan was trembling with rage, the tall man's somber eyes holding with steady purpose. "No man can couple the word treason with my name, sir. Have I done so? You are insinuating it, and I demand a retraction." The President smiled genially. "Then I apologize for my carelessness of expression. I have never believed you a traitor to the Union. Thank you. I don't believe it now, General. That's why I sent for you. Then I suggest that you employ more caution in the use of words if this conversation is to continue. Again, I apologize, General, with admiration for your manner of meeting the ugly subject. I'm glad you can feel that way. And now if you will be seated, we can talk business." McClellan resumed his seat with a frown, and the president went on. "I have sent for you to ask an amazing thing. Hence the secrecy which I am summoned." "Exactly. I'm going to ask you to take my place and save the Union." McClellan's handsome face went white. "What do you mean?" "Exactly as I've said. And your conditions?" the general asked with a quiver in his voice. "They are very simple. Preside tomorrow night at the great Democratic Union mass meeting in New York, and boldly put yourself at the head of the Union democracy. And you?" "I will withdraw from the race." "What race?" "For the next term of the presidency." "Oh, my convention's but 10 months off. Yours can meet a day earlier. I will withdraw in your favor and force my party to endorse you. Your election will be a certainty." The general lifted his hand with a curious smile. "You're in earnest?" "I was never more so. It is needless for me to say that I came into this office with high ambitions to serve my country. My dream of glory is gone. I have left only agony and tears." He paused and drew in a deep breath. "I did want the chance," he went on wistfully, "to stay here another term, to see the sun shine again, to heal my country's deep wounds, and show all my people, north, south, east, and west, that I love them. But I can't risk this new battle if you agree to take my place and save the Union. Will you preside over such a meeting?" "No," was the sharp, clear answer. "I am sorry. Why?" "Perhaps I am already certain of that election without your assistance." "Oh, I see. Besides, what right have you to ask anything of me?" "Only the right of one who sinks all thoughts of himself and what he believes to be the greater good. You, who with victory in my grasp before Richmond snatched it away. You, who nailed me to the cross on the bloody field of Antietam with your accursed proclamation of emancipation, and removed me from my command before I could win my campaign." The big hand rose in kindly protest. "Can't you believe me, General, when I tell you, with God as my witness, that I have never allowed a personal motive or feeling to enter into a single appointment or removal I have made? What I have done has always been exactly what I believed was best for the interest of the country. Can't you believe this?" "No. In spite of the fact that I risked the dissolution of my cabinet and the united opposition of my party when I restored you to command?" "No. You had to do it." "Grant, then," the persuasive voice went on, "that I have treated you unfairly, that I had personal feelings. Sure, you should see in this hour of my reckoning, this hour of Golgotha, which I climbed to the hill alone and asked the man I've wronged to take my place. Surely you should be content with my humiliation. I shall not hesitate to proclaim it from the housetop when I ask for your election. If I have wronged you, my anguish could not be more pitifully complete. Will you do as I ask to assure the safety of our country?" "I'll do my best to save my country," was a slow, firm answer, "but in my own way." The general rose, bowed stiffly, and left the president standing in sorrowful silence, his deep eyes staring into space and seeing nothing. On the morning of July 1st, the two armies were rapidly approaching each other, marching in parallel lines over a vast distance, the extreme wings more than 40 miles apart. Buford, commanding the advance guard of the Union Army, struck Hill's division of the Confederates before the town of Gettysburg, and the first guns of the great battle echoed over the green hills and valleys of Pennsylvania. The president caught the flash of the shot from the telegraph wires with a sense of sickening dread. The rear guard of his army was yet 40 miles away. What might happen before they were in line, God could only tell. He could not know, of course, that but 22,000 Confederates had reached the field and stood confronting 24,000 under John F. Reynolds, one of the ablest and bravest generals of the Union Army. Through every hour of this awful day, he sat in the telegraph office of the War Department and read with bated breath the news. The brief reports were not reassuring. The battle was raging with unparalleled fury. At 10 o'clock, General Reynolds fell dead from his horse in front of his men. When the news was flashed to Meade, he sent Hancock forward, riding at full speed to take command. The president read the message announcing Reynolds' death with quivering lips. He put his big hand blindly over his heart as if to faint. At 3 o'clock, the smoke, which had enveloped the battle line, was lifted by a breeze as Hancock dashed onto the field. He had not arrived a moment too soon, his superb bearing on his magnificent horse. His shouts of confidence, his promise of heavy reinforcements, stayed the line of retreat and brought order out of chaos. The day had been won again by Lee's apparently invincible men. They had driven the Union army from their line a mile in front of Gettysburg back through the town and beyond it, captured the town, taking 5,000 men and blue prisoners and 2 generals, besides inflicting a heavy loss of 3,000 killed and wounded. Among the dead, the gallant and popular command, John F. Reynolds. When this message reached the president late at night, he had eaten nothing since breakfast. He rose from the seat in the telegraph office and walked to the building alone in silence. His step was slow, trance-like, and uncertain, as if he were only half awake or had risen, walking in his sleep. He went to the bedroom, locked the door, and fell on his knees in prayer, hour after hour. He wrestled alone with God in the darkness while his tired army rushed through the night to plant themselves on the heights behind Gettysburg before Lee's men could be concentrated to forestall them again. Over and over again, through somber eyes, a stream of tears, the passionate cry was wrung from his heart. Lord God of our fathers, have mercy on us. I've tried to make this war yours, our cause yours. If I have sinned and come short, forgive me. We cannot endure another Fredericksburg or Chancellorsville. Into thy hands, O Lord, I give our men and our country this night. Save them. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Southerner by Thomas Dixon, a romance of the real Lincoln. Chapter 30, Sunshine and Storm. While the sun rose over Gettysburg on the 2nd day of July, the Union Army, rushing breathlessly through the night to the rescue of its defeated advance corps, had reached the heights beyond the town. Before Longstreet had attempted to obey Lee's command to take these hills, General Meade's blue host had reached them and were entrenching themselves. The Confederate commander discovered that in the death of Jackson, he had lost his right arm. It was 1 o'clock before Longstreet moved to the attack, hurling his columns in reckless daring against these bristling heights. When darkness drew its kindly veil over the scene, Lee's army had driven General Sickles from his chosen position to his second line of defense on the hill behind, gained a foothold in the famous Devil's Den at the base of Round Top, broke the lines of the Union right, and held their fortification on Culp's Hill. The day had been one of frightful slaughter. The Union losses in 2 days had reached the appalling total of more than 20,000 men. Lee had lost 15,000. The brilliant July moon rose and flooded the field of blood and death with silent glory. From every nook and corner, from every shadow, and across every open space, through the hot breath of the night, came the moans of thousands, and louder than all the long agonizing cries for water. Many a man in gray crawled over the ragged rocks to press his canteen to the lips of his dying enemy in blue. And many a boy in blue did as much for the man in gray. 15,000 wounded men lay there through the long hours. At 10 o'clock, a wounded Christian soldier began to sing one of the old sweet hymns of faith, whose words had come ringing down through the ages, wet with tears and ringed with human hopes. In 5 minutes, 10,000 voices of blue and gray, some of them quivering with the agony of death, had joined. For 2 hours, the woods and hills rang with the songs of these wounded men. All through the pitiful music, the Confederates were massing their artillery on Seminary Ridge, replacing their wounded horses and refilling their ammunition chests. The Union Army were burrowing like moles and planting their terrible batteries on the brows and hills beyond the town. At Lee's council of war that night, Longstreet advised his withdrawal from Gettysburg into a more favorable position in the mountains. But the Confederate commander, reinforced now by the arrival of Pickett's division, 15,000 men, and Stuart's cavalry, decided to renew the battle. At the first gray streak of dawn on the 3rd, the Federal guns roared their challenge to the Confederate forces, which had captured their entrenchments on Culp's Hill. 7 terrible hours of bombardment, charge, and countercharge followed until every foot of space had claimed its toll of dead before the Confederates yielded the hill. At noon, there was an ominous lull in the battle. At 1 o'clock, a puff of smoke from Seminary Ridge was followed by a dull roar. The signal gun had pealed its call of death to thousands. For 2 miles along the crest of this ridge, the Confederates had planted 150 guns. 2 miles of smoke-wreathed flame suddenly leaped from those hills in a single fiery breath. The longer line of big Federal guns on Seminary Ridge were silent for a few minutes and then answered gun for gun until the heavens were transformed into a roaring hell of bursting, screaming, flaming shells. For 2 hours the earth trembled beneath the shock of these volcanoes, and then the two storms died slowly away and the smoke began to lift. An ominous sign. The gray infantry were deploying in line under picket to charge the heights of Cemetery Ridge. 15,000 gallant men against an impregnable hill held by 70,000 entrenched soldiers, backed by the deadliest and most powerful artillery. They swept now into the field before the heights, their bands playing as if on parade, their gray ranks dressed on their colors, down the slope, across the plain, and up the hill. The waves rolled, their thinning ranks closing the wide gaps torn each moment by the fiery sleet of iron and lead. A handful of them lived to reach the Union lines on those heights. Armistead, with 100 men, broke through and lifted his battle flag for a moment over a Federal battery and fell mortally wounded. And then the shattered gray wave broke into a spray of blood and slowly ebbed down the hill. The Battle of Gettysburg had ended. For the first time, the Blue Army of the Potomac had won a genuine victory. It had been gained at a frightful cost, but no price was too high to pay for such a victory. It had saved the capital of the nation. The Union Army had lost 23,000 men, and the Confederates had lost 20,000. Meade had lost 17 of his generals, and Lee 14. When the thrilling news from the front reached Washington on the 4th of July, the president lifted his big hands above his head and cried to the crowd of excited men who thronged the executive office, "Unto God we give all the praise." None of those present knew the sole significance of that sentence as it fell from his trembling lips. He seated himself at his desk and quickly wrote a brief proclamation of thanks to Almighty God, which he telegraphed to the governor of each Union state, requesting them to repeat it to their people. While the North was still quivering with joy over the turn of the tide at Gettysburg, Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, hurried into the president's office and handed him a dispatch from the gunboat under Admiral Porter, cooperating with General Grant, announcing the fall of Vicksburg, the surrender of 35,000 Confederate soldiers of its garrison, and the opening of the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico. The president seized his hat, his dark face shining with joy. "I will telegraph the news to General Meade myself." He stopped suddenly and threw his long arms around Welles. "What can we do for the Secretary of the Navy for this glorious intelligence? He is always giving us good news. I cannot tell you my joy over this result. It is great, Mr. Welles. It is great." With the eagerness of a boy, he rushed to the telegraph office and sent the message to Meade over his own signature. For the first time in dreary months, the sun had burst for a moment through the clouds that had hung in endless gloom over the White House. The sorrowful eyes were shining with new hope. The president felt sure that General Lee could never succeed in leading his shattered army back into Virginia. He had lost 20,000 men out of his 62,000. While Meade was still in command of a grand army of 82,000 soldiers flushed with victory. The Potomac River was in flood, and the Confederate army was on its banks, unable to cross. It was a moral certainty that the heroic commander who had saved the capital at Gettysburg could, with his 82,000 men, capture or crush Lee's remaining force, caught in this trap by the swollen river, and end the war. The men who crowded into the executive office the day after the news of Vicksburg found the chief magistrate in high spirits. Among the cases of deserters court-martialed and ordered to be shot, he was surprised to find a Negro soldier bearing the remarkable name of Julius Caesar Thornton. John Vaughan had telegraphed the president asking his interference with the execution of this cruel edict. The president was deeply interested. It was the beginning of the use of Negro troops. He had consented to their employment with reluctance, but they were proving their worth to the army both in battle and in the work of garrisons. Julius was brought from the prison for an interview with the chief magistrate. Stanton had sternly demanded the enforcement of the strictest military discipline as the only way to make these black troops of any real service to the government. He asked that an example be made of Julius by sending him back to the army to be publicly shot before the assembled men of his race. He was convicted of 2 capital offenses. He had been caught in Washington shamelessly flaunting the uniform he had disgraced. Julius faced the president with a humble salute and a broad grin. The black man liked the looks of his judge, and he threw off all embarrassment his situation had produced with the first glance of the kindly eyes gazing at him over the rims of those spectacles. "Well, Julius Caesar Thornton, this is a serious charge they have lodged against you." "Yassa, that's what they say." "You went forth to fight like a man for your country, didn't you?" "Nah, sir." "How'd you get there?" "They volunteered me, sir." "Volunteered you, did they?" The president laughed. "Yassa, they did. They sure volunteered me whether or no, and how'd it happen. They done it so quick, sir, I scarcely know how they did do it. I was in the war down in Virginia with Master John Vaughan, and a low-life Irishman on guard there put me to work burying corpses. I had never had no taste for no corpses nohow, and I didn't like the job, most especially, sir, when one of them come to, I was pulling from the dock to the grave. "Come to, did he?" said the president, smiled. "Yassa. He come to all of a sudden and kicked me, and it scared me about to death. I lit out from there pretty quick, sir, and I go west. And I ain't mo got out there for two fellers draw their muskets on me and persuade me to volunteer, sir. They put these here clothes on me and tells me that I was a hero. I tell them they must be some mistake about that, but they said no, they knows what they was a doing. They keep on telling me that I was a hero, and by golly, I get to believe it myself till they get me into trouble, sir." "You were scratched in battle?" Julius scratched his head and walled his eyes. "I had a little taste of it, sir." "Well, you tried to fight, didn't you?" "No, sir, I run." "Ran at the first fire?" "Yes, sir, and I ran sooner if I'd have known what was coming." Julius paused and broke into a jolly laugh. "They get one pop of me, sir, 'fore I seed what they was doing." The president suppressed a laugh and gazed at Julius with severity. "That wasn't very creditable to your courage." "That ain't my line, sir. I's a cook." "Have you no regard for your reputation?" "That ain't nothing to me, sir, side of life." "And your life ain't worth more than other people's?" "Worth a mo to me, sir." "I'm afraid they wouldn't have missed you, Julius, if you'd been killed." "Nah, sir, but I'd have sure missed myself, and that's the point with me." The president fixed him with a comical frown. "Sweet and honorable to die for one's country, Julius." "Yes, sir, that's what I hear, but I ain't fond of no sweet things. I ain't never had no taste for 'em, sir." "Well, it looks like I'll have to let 'em have you, Julius, for an example. Tried to save you, but there doesn't seem to be anything to take hold of. Every time I grab you, you slip right through my fingers. I reckon they'll have to shoot you." The Negro broke into a hearty laugh. "Wait from here, Mr. President. You can't fool me, sir. I sees you laughing right now back there in your eyes. You ain't gonna let them shoot me. I's too valuable a nigger for that. I was worth $1,000 for the war. I sure ought to be worth 2,000 now. What they worth of destroying a good piece of property like that? I won't be no good to nobody if they shoots me." The president broke down at last, leaned back in his chair, and laughed with every muscle of his long body. Julius joined him with unction. When the laughter died away, the tall figure bent over his desk and wrote an order for the Negro's release and discharge from the army. One of the things which had brought the president his deepest joy was the victory of Vicksburg was not the importance of the capture of the city and the opening of the Mississippi so much as the saving of U.S. Grant as a commanding general. From the capture of Fort Donelson, the eyes of the chief magistrate had been fixed on this quiet fighter, and then came the disaster of his army at Shiloh. The first day's fight, a bloody and overwhelming defeat. The second, the recovery of the ground lost and the death of Albert Sidney Johnston, his brilliant Confederate opponent. As a matter of fact, in its results, the battle had been a crushing disaster to the South. But Grant had lost 14,000 men in 2 days' carnage, and it was the first great field of death the war had produced. McClellan had not yet met Lee before Richmond. The cry against Grant was furious and practically universal. Senator Winter, representing the demands of Congress, literally stormed the White House for weeks with the persistent and fierce demand for Grant's removal. The president shook his head doggedly. "I can't spare this man. He fights." The senator submitted proof that Grant was addicted to the use of strong drink and that he was under the influence of whiskey on the first day of the Battle of Shiloh. In vain, Winter stormed and threatened for an hour. The president was adamant. He didn't know Grant personally, but he had felt the grip of his big personality on the men under his command, and he refused to let him go. He turned to his tormentor at last with a quizzical look in his eye. "You know, Winter, that reminds me of a little story." The senator threw up both hands with a gesture of rage. He knew what the wily diplomat was up to. "I won't hear it, sir," he growled. "I won't hear it. You and your stories are sending this country to hell. It's not more than a mile from there now." The somber eyes smiled as he slowly said, "I believe it is just a mile from here to the Senate chamber." The senator faced him for a moment, and the two men looked at each other, tense, erect, unyielding. "There may or may not be a grain of truth in your statements, Winter," the quiet voice continued, "but your personal animus against Grant is deeper. He is a Democrat married to a Southern woman, and is a slaveholder. You can't be fair to him. I can. I must and I will. I am the president of all the people. The nation needs this man. I will not allow him to be crushed. You have my last word." The senator strode to the door in silence and paused. "But you haven't mine, sir." The tall figure bowed and smiled. The president found a greater task than he had dreamed. So furious was the popular outcry against Grant, so dogged and persistent was the demand for his removal, he was compelled to place General Halleck in nominal command of the district in which his army was operating until the popular furor should subside. In this way, he had kept Grant as second in command at the head of his army, and Vicksburg, with 35,000 prisoners, was the answer the silent man in the West had sent to his champion and protector in the White House. The thrilling message had come at an opportune moment. The new commander of the Army of the Potomac had defeated General Lee at Gettysburg, and for an hour his name was on every lip. The president and the nation had taken it for granted that he would hurl his 82,000 men on Lee's army hemmed in by the impassable Potomac. So sure of this was Stanton that he declared to the president, "If a simple regiment of Lee's army ever gets back into Virginia in an organized condition, it will prove that I am totally unfit to be Secretary of War." Once more the impossible happened. Lee did get back into Virginia, his army marching with quick step and undaunted spirit, ready to fight at any moment his rear guard came in touch with Meade's advancing hosts. He not only crossed the Potomac with his army in perfect fighting form, with every gun he carried, but with thousands of fat cattle and 4,000 prisoners of war captured on the field of Gettysburg. The president's day of rejoicing was brief, as Lee withdrew to his old battleground with his still unconquered lines of gray. The man in the White House saw with aching heart his dream of peace fade into the mists of an even darker night than the one through which his soul had just passed. Slowly but surely, the desperate South began to recover from the shock of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, and filled once more her thinning battle lines. General Lee, sorely dissatisfied with himself for his failure to win in Pennsylvania, tendered his resignation to the Richmond government, asking to be relieved by a younger and abler man. As no such man lived, Jefferson Davis declined his resignation, and he continued his leadership with renewed faith in his genius by every man, woman, and child in the South. General Meade, stung to desperation by the bitter disappointment of the president and the people of the North, also tendered his resignation. For the moment, the president refused to consider it, though his eyes were fixed with growing faith on the silent figure of Grant. One more victory from this stolid fighter, and he had found the greatest commander for which he had sought in vain through blood and tears for more than 2 years. The first task to which he must turn his immediate attention was filling the depleted ranks of the Northern armies. Volunteering had ceased. The terms of the enlisted men would soon expire, and it was absolutely necessary to enforce a draft for 500,000 soldiers. The president had been warned by the Democratic Party, at present a powerful and aggressive minority in Congress, that such an act of despotism would not be tolerated by a free people. The president's answer was simple and to the point. The South has long since adopted force to fill her ranks. If we are to continue in this war and save the Union, It is absolutely necessary, and therefore it shall be done. The great city of New York was the danger point. The government had been warned of the possibility of a revolution in the metropolis, whose representatives in Congress had demanded the right to secede at the beginning of the war. And yet the warning had not been taken seriously by the War Department. No effort had been made to garrison the city against the possibility of an armed uprising to resist the draft. Demagogues had been haranguing the people for months, inflaming their minds to the points of madness on the subject of the draft. On the night before the drawing was ordered in New York, the leading speaker had swept the crowd off their feet by the daring words which he closed his appeal. We will resist this attempt of the black Republicans and abolitionists to force the children of the poor into the ranks they dare not enter. Will you give any more of your sons to be food for vultures on the hills of Virginia? Will you allow them to be torn from your firesides and driven as dumb cattle into the mouths of Southern cannon? If you are slaves, yes. If you are free men, no. When the lottery wheel began to turn off its fatal names at the government draft office at the corner of 46th Street and 3rd Avenue on the morning of July 14th, a sullen, determined mob packed the streets in front of the building. Among them stood hundreds of women whose husbands, sons, and brothers were listed on the spinning wheel of black fortune. Their voices were higher and angrier than the men's. This is a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. Yes, if you've got $300, you can hire a suitable substitute from the slums. But if you happen to be a working man, you can stand up and be shot for these cowards and sneaks. Down with the draft. To hell with the hirelings and their wheel. Smash it. Burn the building. A tough from the east side waved his hand to the crowd of frenzied men and women. Come on, boys. With a single mighty impulse, the mob surged towards the doors and through them. A sound of smashing glass, blows, curses. A man rushed into the street, holding the enrollment books above his head. Here are your names, the list of white slaves. The mob tore the sheets from his grasp and fell on them like hungry wolves. In 10 minutes, the books were only scraps of paper trampled into the filth of 3rd Avenue. Wherever a piece could be seen, men and women stamped and spit on it. They smashed the wheel and furniture into kindling wood, piled it in the middle of the room, and set fire to it. No policemen or firemen were allowed to approach. Every officer of the law, both civil and military, had been chased and beaten and disappeared. Half the block was in flames before the firemen could break through and reach the burning buildings. Down the avenue, the maddened mob swept with resistless impulse, yelling, cursing, shouting its defiance. Down with the abolitionists! Hang Horace Greeley on a sour apple tree! To the Tribune office! Howard, a reporter of the Tribune, was recognized. Kill him! Hang him! The mob seized the reporter, dragged him to a lamppost, and were about to put the rope around his neck when a blow from a cobblestone felled him to the sidewalk, the blood trickling down his neck. A man bending over his body shouted to the crowd, He's dead. We'll take the body anyway. A friend helped, and they carried him to a store and saved his life. For 3 days and nights this mob burned and killed at will and fought every officer of the law until the streets ran red with blood. They burned the Negro Orphans Asylum, beat, killed, or hanged every Negro who showed his face, sacked the home of Mayor Updike at 79 Fifth Avenue and attempted to burn it. They smashed the Tribune building, gutted part of it, and would have reduced it to ashes but for the brave defense put up by some of its men. On the 3rd day, the announcement was made that the draft was suspended. 5,000 troops reached the city and partly succeeded in restoring order. More than 1,000 men had been killed and 3,000 wounded, among them many women. The Democratic papers now boldly demanded that the draft should be officially suspended until its constitutionality could be tested by the courts. The state and municipal authorities of New York appealed to the president to suspend the draft. He answered, If I suspend the draft, there can be no army to continue the war, and the days of the republic are numbered. The life of the nation is at stake. They begged for time, and he hesitated for a day. The victories of Gettysburg and Vicksburg were forgotten in the grim shadow of the possible repetition of the French Revolution on a vast scale throughout the North. The mob had already sacked the offices of the Times and Troy, broken out in Boston, and threatened Cincinnati. The president gave the governor of New York his final answer by sending an army of 10,000 veterans into the city. He planted his artillery to sweep the streets with grape and canister, and ordered the draft to be immediately enforced. The new wheel was set up and turned with bayonets. The mobs were overawed and the ranks of the army were refilled. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 31, Between the Lines. Betty Winter found to her sorrow that the memory of a dead love could be a troublesome thing. Ned Vaughan's tender and compelling passion had been resistless in the moonlight beneath a fragrant apple tree with the old mill splashing its music at their feet. She had returned to her cot in the hospital that night in a glow of quiet, peaceful joy. Life's problems had been solved at last in the sweet peace of a tender and beautiful spiritual love, the only love that could be real. All of this was plain while the glow of Ned's words were in her heart and the memory of his nearness alive in the fingers and lips he had kissed. And then, to her terror, came stealing back to the torturing vision of his brother. Why could she never shut out the memory of this man? Over and over again she repeated the angry final word, "He isn't worth a moment's thought." And yet she kept on thinking, always in the same blind circle. At last came the new resolution. Worthy or unworthy, I've given my word to a better man, and that settles it. The fight had become in her inflamed imagination the struggle between good and evil. The younger man, with his chivalrous boyish ideals, was God, love, light. The older, with his iron will, with his fierce, ungovernable passion, was the devil, lust, and darkness. She trembled with new terror at the discovery that there was something elemental deep within her own life, and answered the challenge of this older voice with a strange, joyous daring. She had risen from her knees, where she had prayed for strength to fight and win this battle, when the maid knocked at the door. She had left the hospital and returned home for a week's rest, tottering on the verge of a nervous collapse since her return from the meeting with Ned. "A letter, Miss Betty," the maid said with a smile. She tore open the envelope with nervous dread. It bore no postmark and was addressed in strange hand. Inside was another envelope in Ned's handwriting, and around it a sheet of paper on which was scrawled, "Dear Miss Winter, the bearer of this letter is a trusted spy of both governments. I have friends in Washington and in Richmond. In Richmond I am supposed to betray the Washington government. In Washington it is known that I am at heart loyal to the Union, and all my correspondence from Richmond to the Confederate agents in Canada and the North I deliver to the President in Stanton. This one is an exception. I happen to have met Mr. Ned Vaughan, and I like him. I deliver this letter to you unopened by any hand. I have a sweetheart myself." With a cry of joy, Betty broke the seal and read Ned's message. It was written just after the Battle of Gettysburg. "Dearest, I am writing you tonight because I must, though this may never reach you. The whole look of war has changed for me since that wonderful hour we spent in the moonlight beside the river, and you promised me your life. It's all a pitiful tragedy now, and love seems the only thing in all of God's universe worthwhile. I do not wish to kill any more. It hurts the big something inside that's divine. I'm surprised at myself that I can't see the issues of national life as I saw them at first. Somehow they have become dwarfed beside the new wonder and glory that fills my heart. And now, like a poor traitor, I am praying for peace at any price. Oh, dearest, you have brought me to this. I love you so utterly with every breath I breathe, every thought of mind, and every impulse of soul and body. How can I see aught else in the world? In every scene of these 3 days of horror through which we've just passed, my thought was of you. The signal gun that called the men to die boomed your name for me. I heard it in the din and roar and crash of armies. The louder came from the call of death, the sweeter life, because life meant you. Life has taken on a new and wonderful meaning. I love it as I never loved it before, and I've grown to hate death. And I whisper it to you, my love, my own, to hate war. I want to live now, and I'm praying for peace. My mind is yet clear on its conviction of right, or I could not stay here a moment longer. But I'm longing and hoping and wondering whether God will show us the way out of your tragic dilemma. During the battle, I found a handsome young federal officer who had fallen inside our lines. With his last strength, he was trying to write a message to his bride, who was waiting for him behind the Union lines. I couldn't pass by. I stopped and got his name, gave him water, and made him as comfortable as possible. I got permission from my general while the battle raged, sent his message with a flag of truce to his wife. She came flying to his side at the risk of her life, got to the rear, and saved him. Perhaps I wasn't an ideal soldier in that pause in my fight, but I had to do it, dearest. It was your sweet spirit that stopped me and sent the white flag of love and mercy. And the strangest of all things of the war happened that night. I spent 6 hours among the wounded, helping the poor boys all that I could, blue and gray. And I suddenly ran into John at the same pitiful work. It's curious how all the bitterness has gone out of my heart. I grabbed him and we hugged him, and we both cried like two fools. We sat down between the lines in the brilliant moonlight and talked for an hour. Told him of you, dearest, and he wished me all the happiness life could give, but with a queer hitch in his voice, and after a long silence which made me wonder if he, too, had not been loving you in secret. I shouldn't wonder if every man who sees you loves you. The wonder to me is if they don't. Our band is playing an old-fashioned Southern song that sets my heart to beating with joyous madness again. I'm dreaming through that song of the home I'm going to build for you somewhere in the land of sunshine. Don't worry about me. I'm not going to die. I know I'm immortal now. I had faith once. Now I know. Because I love you, and time is too short to tell, and all too short to live my love. Ned. She read it over twice through eyes that grew dim with each foolish, sweet extravagance, and then she went back and read for the third time the line about John, threw herself across her bed, and burst into tears. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 32. The Whirlwind. The draft of 500,000 men was scarcely completed when Rosecrans' Western Army advanced into Georgia, met with crushing defeat at Chickamauga, the River of Death. His shattered hosts were driven back into Chattanooga with the loss of 18,000 men in a rout so complete and stunning that Charles A. Dana, the Assistant Secretary of War, telegraphed the President from the front that it was another Bull Run. Rosecrans himself wired that he had met with a terrible disaster. The White House sent him words of cheer. The Confederate commander, General Bragg, rapidly closed in and began to lay siege to Chattanooga, and the defeated Federal Army were put on short rations. The President turned his eyes now from Meade and his Army of the Potomac, which Lee's strategy had completely baffled, and gave his first thought to the armies of the West. He sent Sherman hurrying from the Mississippi to Rosecrans' relief, and Hooker from the east. In place of Rosecrans, he promoted George H. Thomas, whose gallant stand had saved the army from annihilation and won the title, the Rock of Chickamauga. And most important of all, he placed in supreme command of the forces in Tennessee the silent man whose patience and faith had saved the nation, the conqueror of Vicksburg, Ulysses S. Grant. On November 24th and 25th, the new commander raised the siege of Chattanooga and drove Bragg's army from Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain back into Georgia. At last the President had found a man of genius for whom he had long searched. Grant was summoned to Washington and given command of all the armies of the United States, east and west. The new general at once placed William Tecumseh Sherman at the head of an army of 100,000 men at Chattanooga for the purpose of reinvading Georgia, sent General Butler with 40,000 men up the peninsula against Richmond along the line of McClellan's Old March, raised the Army of the Potomac to 140,000 effective fighters, took command in person, and faced General Lee on the old banks of the Rapidan, but a few miles from the old ground in the wilderness around Chancellorsville, where Hooker's men had baptized the earth in heroic blood the year before. Grant's army was the flower of northern manhood, and with its 318 great field guns, the best equipped body of fighting men ever brought together on our continent. His baggage train was over 60 miles long and would have stretched the entire distance to Richmond. By the spring of 1864, when he reached the Rapidan, Lee's army had recruited again to its normal strength of 62,000. A great religious revival swept the southern camps during the winter, and its meetings lasted into the spring, almost to the hour the opening guns of the Wilderness Campaign. Had whispers from the infinite reached the souls of the ragged men in gray and told them of coming Gethsemane and Calvary? Certain it is that though Lee's army were ragged and poorly fed, their courage was never higher, their faith in their commander never more sublime, than in those beautiful spring mornings in April when they burnished their bayonets to receive Grant's overwhelming host. The chaplain of Ned Vaughan's regiment was leading a prayer meeting in the moonlight. An earnest brother was praying fervently for more manhood and more courage. A ragged Confederate kneeling nearby didn't like the drift of his petition, and patience gave out. He raised his head and called, "Say, hold on there, brother. You're getting that prayer all wrong. We don't need no more courage. Got so much of it now we're scared of ourselves sometimes. What we need's provisions. Ask the Lord to send us something to eat. That's what we want now." The leader took the interruption in good spirit and asked an eloquent request for at least one good meal a day, if the Lord in his goodness and mercy could spare it. No persimmon tree was ever stripped without the repetition of their old joke. They all knew the words by heart. "Don't eat those persimmons. They're not good for you." "I know it, man. I'm just doing it to pucker my stomach to fit my rations." Ned was passing the door of a cabin in which a prayer meeting of officers was being held. He walked in with his colonel, who was fond of a sip of corn whiskey at times. He was slightly deaf. The leader of the meeting called from the door. "Won't you join us in prayer, Colonel?" "Thank you, no. I've just had a little," he answered innocently. Ned roared, and the brethren inside the cabin joined the laugh. Nobody of men of any race ever marched to death with calmer faith than those ragged lines of gray now girding their loins for the fiercest, bloodiest struggle in the annals of the world. Lee allowed Grant to cross the Rapidan unopposed and penetrate the tangled wilds of the wilderness. The Southerner knew that in those dense woods the effectiveness of his opponent's superior numbers would be vastly reduced. Longstreet's corps had not yet arrived from Gordonsville, where he had been sent to obtain food, and he must concentrate on the forces. The days were oppressively hot as the men in blue tramped through the forest aisles of the vast Virginia jungle, a maze of trees, underbrush, and dense foliage. A pall of ominous silence hung over this labyrinth of desolation, broken only by the chirp of the bluebird or the distant call of the yellowhammer. Not waiting for the arrival of Longstreet on his forced march from Gordonsville, Lee suddenly threw the half of his army on Grant's advancing men with savage energy. Their march was halted, and through every hour of the day and far into the night the fierce conflict raged. As darkness fell, the Confederates had pushed the blue lines back, captured 4 guns and a number of prisoners, but Longstreet had not come, and Lee's army of barely 40,000 men were in a dangerous position before Grant's legions. Both generals renewed the fight at daylight. The Federals attacked Lee's entire line with terrific force. Just as the Confederate right wing was being crushed and rolled back in disorder, Longstreet reached the field and threw his men into the breach. Lee himself rode to the front to lead the charge and reestablish his yielding lines. From 1,000 throats rose the cry, "Lee to the rear! Go back, General Lee! This is no place for you! We'll settle this!" The men refused to move until their commander had withdrawn, and then with their fierce yell they charged and swept the field. Lee repeated the brilliant achievement of Jackson at Chancellorsville. Longstreet was sent around Hancock's left to turn and assail his flank. The movement was a complete success. Hancock's line was smashed and driven back a mile to his second defenses. General Wadsworth, at the head of his division, was mortally wounded and fell into the hands of the on-sweeping Confederates. Just as the movement had reached the moment of triumph which would have crumpled Grant's army in confusion back on the banks of the river, Longstreet fell, dangerously wounded, struck down by a volley from his own men in exactly the same way and almost the same spot where Jackson had fallen. General Jenkins, who was with him, was instantly killed. The charging hosts were halted by the change of commanders, and the movement failed because of its big purpose. Though at sunset General John B. Gordon broke through Sedgwick's Union line, rolled back his right flank, drove him a mile from his entrenchments, and captured 600 prisoners with 2 brigadier generals. The mysterious fate which had pursued the South had once more stricken down a great commander in the moment of victory and snatched it from his grasp. At Shiloh, Albert Sidney Johnston. At Seven Pines, Joseph E. Johnston. At Chancellorsville, Jackson, and now Longstreet. Grant in 2 days had lost 17,666 men, a larger number than fell under Hooker when he had retreated in despair. Any other general than Grant, the stolid bulldog fighter, would have retreated across the Rapidan to reorganize his bleeding lines. As one of his generals rode up the following morning out of the confusion and horror of the night, Grant, chewing on his cigar, waved his right arm with a quick movement. "It's all right, Wilson. We'll fight again." Next day, the two armies lay in their trenches facing each other in grim silence, Grant determined again to turn Lee's right flank and get between him and Richmond. Lee divined his purpose before a single regiment had begun to march. Spotsylvania Courthouse lay in his right. The Confederate commander hurried his advance guard to the spot and lay in wait for his opponent. The day of the 19th was spent by both armies in adjusting lines and constructing breastworks. These fortifications were made by digging huge ditches, and on the top of their banks fastened heavy logs. The front of these abatis were made by felling the trees and cutting their limbs in such a way that the sharp spikes projected toward the breast of the advancing foe. While placing his guns in position, General Sedgwick was killed by a sharpshooter's bullet, a commander of high character and fearless courage and loved by every man in his army. On the morning of the 10th, Hancock attempted to turn Lee's rear by crossing the Po. The movement failed, and he was recalled with heavy losses under Early's assault, and he recrossed the river. Warren led his division in a determined charge on the Confederate front, and they were mowed down in the hundreds by Longstreet's men behind their entrenchments. They reached the abatis, and one man leaped on the breastworks before they fell back in bloody confusion. General Rice was mortally wounded in this charge. On the left of Warren, Colonel Emory Upton charged and broke through the Confederate lines, capturing 1,200 prisoners, but was driven back at last, with the loss of 1,000 of his men. Grant made him a brigadier general on the field. The first day at Spotsylvania ended with the loss of 4,000 Union men. Lee's losses were less than half that number. The 11th, they paused for breath, and Grant sent his famous dispatch to Washington. "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." On the morning of the 12th, Hancock was ordered to charge at daylight. Lee's lines were spread out in the shape of an enormous letter V. Hancock's task was to capture the angle which formed the key to this position. In pitch darkness, under pouring rain, his four divisions under Birney, Mott, Barlow, and Gibbon slipped through the mud and crept into position within a few hundred yards of the Confederate breastworks. As the first streaks of dawn pierced the murky clouds without a shot, the solid, silent lines of blue rushed this angle and leaped into the entrenchment before the astounded men in gray knew what had happened. So swift was the blow, so surprising, so overwhelming in numbers. The angle was captured practically without a struggle, and 3,000 men within it were forced to surrender with every cannon, musket, color, and 2 generals. It was the most brilliant single achievement of Hancock the Superb. Pressing on, Hancock's men advanced against the second series of trenches a half a mile beyond. Here the fight really began. Into their faces poured a terrific volley of musketry, and General John B. Gordon led his men. In a desperate charge to drive the invaders back, Lee, seeing the dangerous situation, rode to the front with the evident intention of joining the charge. Again the cry rang from the hearts of the men who loved him, "Lee to the rear!" They refused to move until he was out of range of fire. Gordon's men charged and drove the Federal host back until, at last, they stood against the entrenchments they had captured. Reinforcements now poured in from both sides, and the fighting became indescribable in its mad desperation. Thousands of men in blue and men in gray fought face to face and hand to hand. Muskets blazed in one another's eyes and blew heads off. The dead were piled up in rows, 4 and 5 deep, blue and gray, locked in each other's arms. The trenches were filled with the dead and cleared of bodies again and again to make room for the living until they, in turn, were thrown out. Ned Vaughn saw a gray color-bearer's arm shot away at the shoulder, the quivering flesh smeared with mud, stained with powder, and filled with shreds of his gray sleeve, and yet, without blanching, he grasped the colors with his other hand and swept on into the jaws of this flaming hell at the head of his men. The rain of musketry fire against the trees came to Ned's ears in low undertones, like the rattle of the myriads of hailstones under the roof of a house. A gray soldier was fighting a duel to the death with a magnificently dressed officer in blue, bare bayonet against bare sword. The soldier, with a sudden plunge, ran his opponent through. With a shudder, Ned looked to see if it were John. A company of men in blue were caught and cut off by a gray wave and were trying to surrender. Their officers with drawn revolvers refused to let them. "Shoot your officers," a gray man shouted. In a moment, every commander dropped, and the men were marched to the rear. Hour after hour, the flames of hell swirled in an endless whirlwind around this bloody angle. Battle line after battle line rushed in, never to return. Ned saw an oak tree 2 feet in diameter gnawed down by musket balls. It fell with a crash, killing and wounding a number of men. Color bearers waved their flags in each other's faces, clenched and fought like demons. 2 soldiers, their ammunition spent, choked each other to death on top of the entrenchment and rolled down its banks among the torn and mangled bodies that filled the ditch. In the edge of this red whirlwind, Ned Vaughn saw a grim man in gray standing beside a tree, using 2 guns. His wounded comrade loaded one while he took deliberate aim and fired the other. With each crack of his musket, a man in blue was falling. In the center of this mass of struggling maniacs, the men were fighting with gun swabs, hand spikes, club, muskets, stones, and fists. The night brought no rest, no pause to succor the wounded or bury the dead. Through the black murk of darkness, they fought on and on until at last the men who were living sank in their tracks at 3 o'clock before day, and neither line had given from this bloody angle. The rain ceased to fall, the clouds lifted, and the waning moon came out. Ned Vaughn, passing over the outer field, saw a long line of men in regular ranks in an odd position. He turned to the commander. "Why don't you move that line of battle now to make it conform to your own?" "They're all dead men," was the quiet answer. "They are Georgia soldiers." John Vaughn on the other side, crossing an open space, came on a blue battle line, asleep, rank on rank, skirmishers in front and battle lines behind, all asleep on their arms. There was no one near to answer a question. They were all dead. The blue and gray men were talking to one another now. "Well, Johnny," a Yankee called through the shadows, "I can't admit that you're inspired of God, but after today, I must say you are possessed of the devil." "Same to you, Yank. Your papers say we're all demoralized anyhow, so tomorrow you oughtn't have no trouble finishing us." Shut up, Johnny. Go to sleep." "All right. Good night, Yank. Hope you rest well. We'll give you hell at daylight." For 5 days, Grant swung his blue lines in circles of blood, trying in vain to break Lee's ranks, and gave it up. He had lost at Spotsylvania 18,000 more men. The stolid, silent man of iron nerves was terribly moved by the frightful losses his gallant army had sustained. He watched with anguish against the endless lines of wagons bearing the stricken men from the field. Lee's forces had been handled with such consummate and terrible skill. His crushing numbers had made little impression. Grant was facing a new force in the world. The ordinary methods of war which he had used with success in the West went here for nothing. The devotion of Lee's men was a mania. Small as his army was, the bulldog fighter saw with amazement that it was practically unconquerable in a square hand-to-hand struggle. Once more he was forced to maneuver for advantage in position. He ordered a new flank movement by the North Anna River. He had opened his fight with Lee on the 5th, and in 2 weeks he had lost 36,000 men without gaining an inch in the execution of his original plan of thrusting himself between the Confederate leader and the capital. Lee's army was apparently as terrible as a fighting machine as on the day they met. A truce now followed to bury the dead and care for the wounded. So sure had Grant been of crushing his opponent, he had refused to agree to this during the struggle. They found them piled 6 layers deep in the trenches, blue and gray, blue and gray. Black wings were spread over the top with red beaks, tearing at the eyes and lips, while deep down below yet groaned and moved the living wounded. God of love and pity, draw the veil over the scene. No pen can tell its story, no heart endure to hear it. The stop was brief. Already the cavalry were skirmishing for the next position. Again, the keen eye of Lee had divined his enemy's purpose. By a shorter road, his men had reached the North Anna before Grant. When the Union leader arrived on the scene, he found the position of his advanced division dangerous, and quickly withdrew with the loss of 2,000 men. Once more he determined to turn Lee's flank and hurled his army toward Cold Harbor. This time he reached his chosen ground before his opponent, and on the 31st, Sheridan's cavalry took possession of the place. The two armies had rushed for this point in waving parallel lines, flashing at each other death-dealing volleys as they touched. Both armies immediately began to entrench in their chosen positions. Lee, familiar with his ground, had chosen his position with consummate skill. On June the 1st, the preliminary attack was made at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. It was short and bloody. The Northern Division under Smith and Wright charged and lost 2,200 men in an hour. Again, Lee had placed his guns and infantry in a fiery crescent on the hills, arranged to catch both flanks in front of an advancing army. Grant's soldiers knew that grim work had been cut out for them on that fateful morning of the 3rd day of June. As John Vaughan walked along the lines the night before, he saw thousands of silent men busy with their needle and thread, sewing their names on their underclothes. The hot close weather of the preceding days had ended in a grateful rain at 5 o'clock, which continued through the night and brought the tired, suffering men gracious relief. Grant decided to assault the whole Confederate front and gave his orders for the attack at the first streak of dawn at 4:30. The charging blue host literally walked into the crater of a volcano, flaming in their faces and pouring tons of steel and lead into their stricken flanks. Nothing like it had ever been seen in the history of war. 10,000 men in blue fell in 20 minutes. The battle was practically over at 7:30 o'clock. General Smith received an order from Meade to renew the assault and flatly refused. The scene which followed had no parallel in the records of human suffering. Its horror is inconceivable and unthinkable. Through the summer nights, the shrieks and groans of the wounded and dying rose in pitiful, endless waves, and no hand was lifting to save them. For 3 days they lay begging for water, groaning and dying where they had fallen. It was certain death to venture out in that storm-swept space. Only a few men fought their way through to rescue a fallen comrade. It was not until the 7th that a truce was arranged to clear the shamble, and then every man in blue was dead save 2. Everywhere blood, 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 in dark slippery pools, dead horses, dead men, smashed guns, legs, arms, torn and mangled pieces of bodies. The earth plowed with shot and shell. 30 days had passed since Grant met Lee in the tangled wilderness, and the Northern Army had lost 60,000 men, 2,000 a day. It is small wonder that he decided not to try longer to fight it out on that line. Lee had put out of combat as many men for his opponent as he had under his command at any time, and his army, with the reinforcements he had received, was now as strong as the day he met Grant. For 12 days the two armies lay in their entrenchments on this field of death, while the Federal commander arranged a new plan of campaign. The sharpshooting was incessant. No man in the line of blue could stand erect and live an instant. Soldiers whose time of service had expired and were ordered home had to crawl on their hands and knees through the trenches to the rear. The new commander, on whose genius the President and the people placed their brightest hopes, had just reached the spot where McClellan stood in June 1862, and he might have gotten there by the James under cover of his gunboats without the loss of a single life. Again, John Vaughan's memory turned to McClellan with desperate bitterness. The longer he brooded over the hideous scenes of the past month, the higher rose his blind rage against the President. End of Chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 33, The Brothers Meet. When Julius, who had returned to John Vaughan's service, saw those piles of dead men on the field of Cold Harbor, he lost faith in the Union cause. He made up his mind that the past month's work had more than paid for the letter to the President, and he took to the woods on his own hook. He lay down to sleep the night he deserted in a clump of trees near the Confederate outposts, and rested his head on a pillow of pine straw. When he waked in the morning at dawn, he felt something tickle his nose. He cautiously reached one hand up to see what it was and felt a lock of hair. He rose slowly, fearing to look till he had gained his feet. He turned his eye at last and saw that he had been sleeping on a dead man's head, protruding through the shallow dirt and pine straw that had been hastily thrown over it the first day of battle. With a yell of terror, he started on the run for his life. He never stopped until he had flanked Lee's army by a wide swing, made his way to the rear, and joined the Confederacy. Grant had now changed his plan of campaign. He determined to capture Petersburg by a coup and cut the communication of Lee and Richmond with the South. The coup failed. The ragged remnants of Lee's army, which had been left there to defend it, held the trenches until reinforcements arrived. He determined to take it by a resistless concerted assault. On the 16th, he threw 3 of his army corps on Beauregard's thin lines at Petersburg, capturing 4 redoubts. At daylight on the 17th, he again hurled his men on Beauregard and drove his men out of his first line of defense. All day, the defenders held their second line though Grant's cracked divisions poured out their blood like water. At night fell the dead, were once more piled high. On the Federal front, the Confederate dead filled the trenches. As the third day dawned, the fierce assault was renewed, but Lee had brought up Anderson's corps with Kershaw and Field's division, and blue waves broke against the impregnable gray ranks and rolled back, leaving the dead in dark heaps. As the shadow of night fell, Grant withdrew his shattered lines to their trenches. He had lost 10,500 more men and had failed. He began to burrow his fortifications into the earth around Petersburg and try by siege what had been found impossible by assault. Further and further crept his blue lines with pick and axe and spade and shovel, digging, burrowing, piling their dirt and timbers. Before each blue rampart silently grew one in gray, until the two siege lines stretched for 37 miles in bristling, flaming semicircle, covering both Richmond and Petersburg. Again, Grant planned a coup. He chose the role of the fox this time instead of the lion. He selected the key of Lee's long lines of defense and sent a regiment of Pennsylvania miners to work digging a tunnel under the Confederate fort known as Elliott's Salient, which stood but 200 yards in front of Burnside's corps. The tunnel was finished, the mine ready, the fuses set, and 8,000 pounds of powder placed in the earth beneath the unsuspecting Confederates. Hancock's division, with Sheridan's cavalry, was sent to make a demonstration against Richmond and draw Lee's main army to its defense. The ruse was partly successful. They were but 18,000 behind the defense of Petersburg on the dark night when Grant massed 50,000 picked men before the doomed fort. The pioneers with their axes cleared the abatis and opened the way for the charging hosts. Heavy guns and mortars were planted to sweep the open space beyond the salient and beat back any attempted countercharge. The time set for the explosion was just before dawn. The fuse was lit, and 50,000 men stood gripping their guns, waiting for the shock. A quarter of an hour passed, and nothing happened. An ominous silence broke over the dawning sky. The only sounds heard were the twitter of waking birds in the trees and hedgerows. The fuse had failed. Two heroic men crawled into the tunnel and found it had spluttered out in a damp spot but 50 feet from the powder. They required an hour to secure and plant a new fuse. Day had dawned. Just in front of John Vaughan's regiment, a Confederate spy was caught. He could hear every word of the pitiful tragedy. He was a handsome, brown-eyed youngster of 18. He glanced pathetically toward the doomed fort and shook his head. 15 minutes more and I'd have saved you, boys. He turned then to his executioners. May I have just a minute to pray? Yes. He knelt and lifted his head, the fine young lips moving in silence as the first rays of the rising sun flooded the scene with splendor. May I write just a word to my mother and my sweetheart? He asked with a smile. They're just over there in Petersburg. Yes. They gave him a piece of paper and he wrote his last words of love, and in a moment was swinging from the limb of a tree. Only a few of the more thoughtful men paid any attention. It was nothing. Such things happened every day. God only kept the records. The new fuse was set and lighted. The minutes seemed like hours as the men waited breathlessly. With a dull, muffled roar from the center of the earth, beneath their very feet, the fort rose 200 feet straight into the sky, driven by a tower of flame that stood stark and red in the heavens. And then, with a blinding crash, the mighty column of earth, guns, timber, the 300 gray bodies sank into the yawning crater. The pit was 65 feet wide and 300 feet long. The explosion had been a complete success. The undermined fort had been wiped from the landscape. A great gap opened in Lee's lines, marked by the grave of 300 of his men. Burnside's division rushed into the crater and climbed through the breach. His men were met promptly by Ransom's brigade of North Carolinians and held. The Union support became entangled in the hole, stumbled and fell in confusion. General Mahone's brigades, hastily called, rushed into position, and a general Confederate charge was ordered. In silence, their arms trailing by their sides, they quickly crossed the open space and fell like demons on the confused blue lines which were driven back into the crater and slaughtered like sheep. The Confederate guns were trained on the yawning pit, whose edge now bristled with flaming muskets. Regiment after regiment of blue were hurled into this hellhole to be torn and cut to pieces. A division of Negro troops were hurried in, and the sight of them drove the Southerners to desperation. It took but a moment's grim charge to hurl these black regiments back to the pit. on the bodies of their fallen white comrades. The crater became a butcher's shambles. When the smoke cleared, 4,000 more of Grant's men lay dead and wounded in the grave in which had been buried 300 gray defenders. Lee's losses were less than one-third as many. Grant asked for a truce to bury his dead, and from 5 until 9 the next morning there was no firing along the grim lines of siege for the first time since the day Petersburg had been invested. So confident now was Lee that he could hold his opponent's position against any assault his powerful opponent could make, he detached Jubal Early with 20,000 men and sent them through the Shenandoah Valley to strike Washington. Grant was compelled to send Sheridan after him. In the meantime, he determined to take advantage of Lee's reduced strength and cut the Weldon Railroad, over which were coming all supplies from the south. Warren's corps was sent on this important mission. His attack failed, and he was driven back with a loss of 3,000 men. He entrenched himself and called for reinforcements. Hancock's famous corps was hurried to the assistance of Warren. John Vaughan's regiment was now attached to Hancock's army. As they were strapping on their knapsacks for the march, to his amazement, Julius suddenly appeared, grinning and bustling about if he had never strayed from the fold. His clothes were in shreds and tatters. "Where have you been all this time, nigger?" John asked. "Who, me? And where'd you get that new suit of clothes?" "Well, I gon' tell you the God's truth, Master John. Out of that Cold Harbor business, I lit out for the other side. I was getting along very well down with General Elliott in the Confederacy when all of a sudden something busted and blowed me clean back to the Union. And here I is, yassa, and I is going to stick by you nows, 'cause like the ain't no rest for the weary nowhere." John was glad to have his entertaining cook once more and received the traitor philosophically. Lee threw A.P. Hill's corps between Warren and Hancock's advancing divisions. Hancock entrenched himself along the railroad which he was destroying. Hill trained his artillery on these trenches and charged them with swift desperation late in the afternoon. The Union lines were broken and crushed, and the men fled in panic. In vain, Hancock the Superb, who had seen his soldiers fall but never failed, tried to rally them. In agony, he witnessed their utter rout. His trenches were taken, his guns captured, and turned into a storm of death on his fleeing men. He lost 12 stands of colors, 9 big guns, and 2,500 men. As the darkness fell, General Nelson A. Miles succeeded in rallying a new line and stayed the panic by a desperate countercharge. Once more, the grapple was hand-to-hand, man-to-man in the darkness. John Vaughan had fired the last load, save one, from his revolver, and sword in hand was cheering his men in a mad effort to regain their lost entrenchments. Blue and gray were mixed in black confusion. Only by the light of flashing guns could friends be distinguished from foes. A musket flamed near his face, and through the deep darkness which followed a sword thrust pierced his side. He sprang back with an oath and clinched with his antagonist, feeling for his throat in silence. For a moment they wheeled, struggled, and fought in desperation, stumbling over underbrush, slipping to their knees and rising. Every instinct of the fighting brute in a man was up now, and the battle was to the death for one, perhaps both. John succeeded at last in releasing his right hand and drawing his revolver. His enemy sprang back at the same moment, and through the darkness again came the sword into his breast. He felt the blood following the blade as it was snatched away, raised his revolver, and fired the last shot squarely at his foe. The muzzle was less than 2 feet from his face, and in the flash he saw Ned's look of horror, both brothers recognizing each other at the same instant. "John, my God, it's you." Yes, and it's you. God have mercy. If I'd killed you." In a moment, the older brother had caught Ned's sinking body and lowered it gently on the leaves. "It's all right, John, old man," he gasped. "If I have to die, it's just as well by your hand. It's war. It's hell. All hell, anyhow. What's the difference?" "But you mustn't die, boy," John whispered fiercely. "You mustn't, I tell you." "I didn't want to die," Ned sighed. "Life was just becoming real beautiful, wonderful." He stopped and drew a deep breath. John bent over Ned's arm and slipped toward his neck, and his fingers touched the warm blood soaking his clothes. "I'm afraid I got you too, John." "No, I'm all right. Brace up, boy. Pull that devil will of yours together. We've both got it and can live." The younger man's head had sunk on his brother's blood-stained breast. "Now look here, Ned, old man. This'll never do. Don't give up." The answer came faint and low. Tell Betty, when you see her, that with my last breath I spoke her name by face, lights, the dark way. You're going, Ned? Yes, say you forgive me. There's nothing to forgive. It's all right, John. Goodbye. The boy stopped. The battle had ceased. The woods were still. The older brother could feel the slow rising and falling of the strong young chest, as if the muscles in the glory of their perfect life refused to hear the call of death. He bent in darkness and kissed the trembling lips, and they too were still. He drew himself again against the trunk of a tree, and through the beautiful summer night held the body of his dead brother in his arms. His fevered eyes were opened at last, and he saw the war as it is for the first time. It had meant nothing before, this reckoning of the dead and wounded after the battle. 60,000 men from the Rapidan to Cold Harbor in 30 days. 10,500 in the futile dash against Petersburg. 4,000 in the crater. 5,500 more on this torn, twisted railroad, and all a failure. Not an inch of ground gained. These torn and mangled bundles of red rags he had watched the men dump into the trenches and cover with dirt had meant nothing real. They were only loathsome things to be hidden from sight before the bugles called the army to move. Now he saw a vision. Over every bundle on those blood-soaked fields bent a brother, a father, a mother, a sister, a sweetheart. He heard their cries of anguish until all the other sounds were dumb. The heaps of amputated legs and arms he had seen so often without a sigh, they were now bathed in tears. The surgeons with their hands and arms and clothes soaked red with blood, he saw them with the eyes of love. Scene on scene in hideous view, the young officer at Cold Harbor, whose leg they were cutting off without the use of chloroform, his face convulsed, his jaws locked as the knife crashed through the nerve and sinew, muscle and artery, and those saws gnawing through bones. God in heaven, he could hear them all now. They were cutting and tearing those he loved. He heard their terrible orders with new ears. For the first time he realized what they meant. Give them the bayonet now. The low, savage, subdued tones of the officer had once thrilled his soul. The memory sickened him. He could hear the impassioned speech of the colonel as the men lay flat on their faces on the grass, the click of bayonets in their place, the look on their faces of the men, eager, fierce, intense, as they sprang to their feet at the call. Charge! And the fight. A big, broad-shouldered brute is trying to bayonet a boy of 15. The boy's slim hand grips the steel with an expression of mingled rage and terror. He holds on with grim fury. A comrade rushes to his rescue. His bayonet misses the upper body of the strong man and crashes hard against his hip bone. The man, with his strength, seizes the gun, snatches it from his bleeding thigh, and swings it over his head to brain his new antagonist, when the first boy, with a savage laugh, plunges his bayonet through the strong man's heart, and he falls with a dull crash, breaking the steel from the musket's muzzle and lying quivering with the blood-spouting point protruding from his side. He understood now these weren't not soldiers obeying orders. These were fathers, brothers, and playmates, killing and maiming and tearing each other to pieces. Lord God of love and mercy, the pity and horror of it all. It was 1 o'clock before Julius, searching the field with a lantern, came on him huddled against the tree with Ned's body still in his arms, staring into the dead face. End of Chapter 33. Chapter 34 of The Southerner. A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 34, Love's Pledge. Again Betty Winter found in her work relief from despair. She had hoped for peace in the beauty and tenderness of Ned's chivalrous devotion. Yet his one letter reporting the meeting had revealed her mistake. The moment she had read his confession, the impulse to scream her protest to John was all but resistless. She had tried in vain to find a way of writing to Ned to tell him that she had deceived him and herself and asked for his forgiveness. It was impossible to write to John under such conditions, and she had suffered in silence. And then the wounded began to pour into Washington from Grant's front. The like of that procession of ambulances from the landing on 6th Street to the hospitals on the hills back of the city had never been seen. The wounded men were brought on swift steamers from Aquia Creek. Floors and decks were covered with mattresses on which they lay as thickly as they could be placed. As the wounded died on the way, they were moved to the bow and their faces covered. At the landing, tender hands were lifting them into the ambulances which slowly moved in one line to the hospitals and back in a circle by another. These ambulances stretched in tragic, unbroken procession for 3 miles and never ceased to move on and on, in an endless circle for 3 days and nights. In an agony of anxiety, Betty asked to be transferred to the landing that she might watch them fill the wagons. Her soul was oppressed with certainty that John Vaughan would be found in one of them. On the morning of the 3rd day, they were still coming in never-ending streams from the steamer decks. She wrung her hands in the moment of despair. Merciful God, are they bringing back Grant's whole army? The patience of these suffering men was sublime. Only a sigh from one who could rise no more. Only a groan here and there from parched lips that asked for water. At last came the ominous news for which she had watched and waited with sickening foreboding. The Republican printed the name of Captain John Vaughan among the wounded in the fight of Warren and Hancock's corps over the Weldon Railroad. There were only 2,000 wounded men sent in on the steamers from the front after this battle, and they arrived at night. Betty hurried to the landing, and she found the ambulances had begun to move. She searched every face in vain, and when the last stretcher had passed out, walked with trembling steps and scanned each silent covered face in the bow. Thank God, she murmured, he's not here. She must begin now the patient search among the 80,000 sick and wounded men in the city of the Sorrow on the Hills. She secured a hack and tried to reach the head of the procession and find the destination of the first wagons that had left before her arrival. It was after midnight. A thunderstorm suddenly rolled its dense clouds over the city and smothered the street lamps in a pall of darkness. The rain burst with a flash of lightning and poured in torrents. The electric display was awe-inspiring. The horses in one of the ambulances in the long line stampeded and smashed the vehicle in front. The procession was stopped in the height of the storm. The vivid flame was now continuous, and Betty could see the wagons standing in a mud-splattered row. For a mile, the lightning play, bringing out in startling outline each horse and vehicle. From every ambulance was hanging a fringe of curious objects shining white against the shadows when suddenly illuminated. Betty looked in with pity and awe. They were the burning, fevered arms and legs and heads of the suffering wounded men, eager to feel the splash of the cooling rain. A full week passed before her search ended, and she located him in one of the big new buildings hastily constructed of boards. With trembling steps, she started to go straight towards his cot. The memory of his brutal stare that day stopped her, and she scribbled a line and sent it to him. John, dearest, may I see you in a moment? Betty. The doctor assured her that he was rapidly recovering, though restless and depressed. She caught her breath in a little gasp of surprise at the sight of his white face, pale and spiritual looking now from the loss of blood. Her eyes were shining with intense excitement as she crossed the room and dropped on her knees beside his cot and seized his hands. Oh, John, John, can you ever forgive me? He slipped his arm around her neck and held her a long time in silence. The men in the room paid no attention to the little drama. It was happening every day around them. Oh, dearest, she went on eagerly, I tried to put you out of my heart, but I couldn't. I'm all yours, body and soul. Love asks but one question. Do you love me? Forever, he whispered. In my loneliness and despair, I tried to give myself to Ned, but I couldn't, dear. I would have told him so had I been able to reach him, though I dreaded to hurt him. John drew her hands down and looked at her with a strange expression. He's beyond the reach of pain and disappointment now, dear. Dead? She gasped. The man only nodded and clung desperately to her hand, while her head sank in a flood of tears. We'll cherish his memory, he said in a curiously quiet voice, as one of the sweetest bonds between us, my love. Yes, always, was the low answer. For the life of him, John Vaughan couldn't tell the terrible fact that his hand had struck him down. God alone should know that. When she had recovered from the shock of the announcement, Betty caressed his hand gently. We just love whom we love, dearest, and we can't help it. I am yours and you are mine. It's not a question of good or bad, right or wrong. We love, that's all. Yes, we love, that's all, and it's everything. There's no more doubt, dear. Not one, she cried. I'm going to bring back the red blood to your cheeks and take that fevered look out of your eyes. The weeks of convalescence were swift and beautiful to Betty, her ministry to his slightest whim a continuous joy. The only cloud in her sky was the strange, feverish, and quiet look in his eyes. On the day of his discharge, he received a letter from his mother, which deepened this expression to the verge of mania. "What is it, dear?" Betty asked in alarm. "One of those unfortunate things that have been happening somewhere every day for the past year. An arrest and imprisonment for treasonable utterances." "Who has been arrested?" "This time my father in Missouri." "Your father?" she gasped. "Yes. Seems he's been a bitter critic of the war. He seems to have gone too far. There was a riot of some sort in a village, and he took the wrong side." There was an ominous quiet in the way he talked. "I'll take you to see the president, dearest," she said soothingly. "We'll ask for his release. I'm sure it will be granted." John's eyes suddenly flashed. "You think so?" "Absolutely sure of it." "We'll try it then," he said with a cold ring in his voice that chilled Betty's heart and sent her home wondering at its meaning. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 35, The Darkest Hour. In the summer of 1864, the president saw the darkest hours of his life. The change in his appearance was startling and pitiful. His somber eyes seemed to have sunk into their caverns beneath the bushy brows and all but disappeared. Their gaze was more and more detached from earth and set on some dim, invisible shore. Deeper and deeper sank the furrows in his ashen face. The shoulders drooped beneath a weight too great for any human soul to bear. To Betty Winter's expression of loyalty and sympathy, he answered sadly, "It's success I need, child, not sympathy. My own burdens and cares are nothing to my soul. It's our cause, our cause. The Union must live, or I shall die." He sat sometimes by his window for hours, immovable as a marble statue, his deep, hungry eyes gazing forever over the shining river toward the southern hills. His secretary stepped softly about the room in silent symphony with the chief they loved with passionate devotion. Grant had crossed the Rapidan on that glorious spring morning in May with his magnificent army, accompanied by the highest hopes of millions, and there had followed those sickening battles, one after another, until he had fallen back in failure before the impassable trenches around Petersburg. The star of Grant, the conquering hero of the West, had apparently sent in a sea of blood. Lee, with inferior numbers, alert, resourceful, vigilant, had checked and baffled him at every turn, and Richmond's fall was no nearer to human eye than in 1862. The miles and miles of hospital barracks in Washington, crowded to their doors with wounded, dying men, were living witnesses of the nation's mortal agony. Every city, town, village, hamlet, and county in the North was mourning. Death had literally flung its pall over the world. From these thousands of stricken homes there had slowly risen a storm of protest against the new leader of the army. The word butcher was on every lips. General Grant, they said, possessed merely the qualities of the bulldog fighter, tenacity and persistence. He held what he had won so long as the men were poured into his ranks by the tens of thousands to take the place of the dead. They declared that he possessed no genius, no strategic skill, no power to originate plans and devise means to overcome his skillful and brilliant antagonist. The demand was pressed on the president for his removal. His refusal had brought on him the blame for all the blood and all the suffering and all the failures of the past bitter year. His answer to his critics was remorseless in its common sense, but added nothing to his hold on the people. "We must fight to win," he firmly declared. "Grant is the ablest general we have yet developed. His losses have been appalling, but his struggle is now to the bitter end. Our resources are exhaustless. The South cannot replace her fallen soldiers. Her losses are fatal. Ours are not." In the face of a political campaign, he prepared a call by draft for 500,000 more men and issued a proclamation appointing a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer. The spirits of the people touched the lowest tide ebb of despair. The war debt had reached the appalling total of 2,000 millions of dollars, and its daily cost was 4 millions. The paper of the Treasury was rapidly depreciating and the premium on gold rising until the value of $1 greenback note was less than 50 cents in real money. The bankers, fearing the total bankruptcy of the nation, had begun to refuse further loans on bonds at any rate of interest. The bounty offered to men for re-enlistment in the Army when their terms expired amounted to the unheard-of sum of $1,500 cash on signing for a new term. Bounty jumping had become the favorite sport of adventurous scoundrels. Millions of dollars were being stolen by these men without the addition of a musket to the fighting forces. Grant was hanging them daily, but the traitors' work continued. The enlisted men deserted in 3 weeks and reappeared at the next post and re-enlisted again, collecting his bounty with each enrollment. The enemies of the president and his own party, led by Senator Winter, to make sure of his defeat before the convention which was about to meet in Baltimore, held a national convention of radical Republicans in Cleveland and nominated John C. Fremont for the presidency. Their purpose was, by this party division, to make Lincoln's nomination an impossibility. Fremont's withdrawal was the weapon with which they would fight the president before the regular Republican convention and afterward. Senator Winter voiced the feeling of this convention in a speech of bitter and vindictive eloquence. "I denounce the administration of Abraham Lincoln," he declared, "as imbecile and vacillating. We demand not only the crashing of Lee's army, but a program of vengeance against the rebels, which will demand their annihilation when conquered. We demand the confiscation of their property, the overthrow of every trace of local government, and the reduction of their states to conquered provinces under the control of Congress. The milk and water policy of Lincoln is both a civil and military failure, and his renomination would be the greatest calamity which could befall our nation." A week later, the regular party convention met at Baltimore. On the night before this meeting, the president's renomination was not certain. On every hand, his enemies were assailing him with unabated fury. Every check to the national arms was laid at his door, every mistake of civil or military management. The ravages of the Confederate cruisers, which were built in England and had swept the seas of our commerce, were blamed on him. He should have called Great Britain to account for these outrages and had 2 wars instead of 1. The cost of the great struggle mounting into the billions was his fault. The draft might have been avoided with the government in abler hands. The emancipation policy had not freed a single Negro and driven the whole Democratic Party into opposition to the war. His border state policy had held 4 slave states in the Union, but crippled the moral power of his position as an anti-slavery man. Every lie, every slander of 4 years were now repeated and magnified. A competent man must be put into the White House. The rail splitter must go. The real test of strength would come in the secret meeting of the Grand Council of the Union League, the secret society which had been organized to defeat the schemes of the Knights of the Golden Circle. In this meeting, men will say exactly what they think. In the big convention tomorrow, all will be in harmony and peace. The convention will do what these powerful leaders from every state in the North tell them to do. The assembly is dignified and orderly. The men who compose it are the eyes and ears and brains of the party they represent. They are the real rulers of the nation. The party will obey their orders. These are the men who do the executive thinking for millions. The millions can only reject or ratify their wills. We are a democracy in theory, but in reality, here is assembled the aristocracy of brains, which constitutes our government. The Grand President Edmunds raps for order and faces a crowd of keen, intelligent leaders of men, his equal in culture and will. The meeting is called but for one purpose. With swift, direct action, the battle begins. A friend of the president offers a resolution endorsing his administration, preceded by a preamble which declares it to be unwise to swap horses while crossing a stream. The big guns open on the battle line without a moment's hesitation. Senator Winter has not thought it wise to make this opening speech. The prominent party took in organizing and launching the Fremont Convention has put him in the position of an avowed bolder. He has already put forward a colleague from the Senate who is supposed to be friendly to the administration. The senator is a man of blunt speech and dominating personality. He speaks with earnestness, conviction, and eloquence. He does not mince words. All of the petty grievances and mistakes and disappointments of his 4 years under the tall, quiet man's strong hands are firing his soul now with burning questions. He boldly accuses the president of tyranny, usurpation, illegal acts, of abused power, of misused advantages, of favoritism, stupidity, frauds in administration, timidity, sluggish inaction, oppression, the willful neglect of suffering, and the willful refusal to hear the cry of the downtrodden slave. He turns the battery of his scorn now on his personal peculiarities, his drawn and haggard and sorrow-marked face, his heartlessness in reading and telling funny stories, and last of all, his selfish ambition which asks a second term at the sacrifice of his party and country. A congressman of unusual brilliance and power follows this assault with one of even greater eloquence and bitterness. 2 more in quick succession, and all demand with one accord the same thing: down with Lincoln. Not a voice has been lifted in his favor. If he has a friend, he is apparently afraid to open his mouth. And then the giant form of Jim Lane slowly rises. He looks quietly over the crowd as if passing in review the tragic events of 4 years. Is he going to add his voice to this chorus of rage? A year ago, in the same grand council, he had a bitter grievance against the president and assailed him furiously. Yesterday, he was at the White House and came away with a shadow in his strong face. He stood for a long time in silence and seemed to be scanning each individual in the crowd of tense listeners, and then his deep voice broke the stillness. His words rang like the boom of cannon, and their penetrating power seemed to pierce the brick walls of the room. Mr. President and gentlemen of the Grand Council, to stir up sore and wounded hearts to bitterness requires no skill or power of oratory. To address the minds of men sickened by disaster, wearied by long trial, heated by passion, bewildered by uncertainty, heavy with grief, and cunningly to turn themselves into one vindictive channel, into one blind rush of senseless fury, requires no great power of oratory and no great mastery of the truth. It may be the trick of a charlatan. He paused and gazed with deliberate and offensive insolence into the face of the men who had spoken. Their eyes blazed with wrath, and a fierce thrill of excitement swept the crowd. For a man to address himself to an assembly like this, however, goaded to madness by suffering, sorrow, humiliation, perplexity, and now roused by venomous arts to an almost unanimous condemnation of the innocent, I say to address you, turn in your tracks and force you to go the other way. That would indeed be a feat of transcendent oratorical power. I am no orator, but I'm going to tell you the truth, and the truth will make you do that thing. Men began to lean forward in their seats as much with impassioned faith. He told the story of the matchless work the great lonely spirit had wrought for his people in the White House during the past passion-torn years. His last sentence rang like the clarion peal of a trumpet. Desert him now, and the election of George B. McClellan on a peace-at-any-price party platform is a certainty. The Union is dissolved, the Confederacy established, and the slaves reshackled, the dead dishonored, and the living disgraced. His last sentence was an angry shout whose passion swept the crowd to its feet. The resolution was passed, and Lincoln's nomination became a mere formality. But Senator Winter had only begun to fight. His whole life as an abolitionist had been spent in opposition to majorities. He had no constructive power and no constructive imagination. His genius was purely destructive, but it was genius. Without a moment's delay, he began his plans to force the president to withdraw from his own ticket in the midst of his campaign. The one ominous sign which the man in the White House saw with dread was the rapid growth through these dark days of a peace-at-any-price sentiment within his own party lines in the heart of the loyal North. Again, Horace Greeley in his great paper voiced this cry of despair. The mischief he was doing was incalculable because he persisted in teaching the millions who read his paper that peace at any time was possible if Abraham Lincoln would only agree to accept it. As a Southern-born man, the president knew the workings of the mind of Jefferson Davis as clearly as he understood his own. Both of these men were born in Kentucky, within a few miles of each other, on almost the same day. The president knew that Jefferson Davis would never consider any settlement of the war except on the basis of the division of the Union and the recognition of the Confederacy. When Greeley declared that the Confederate commissioners were in Canada with offers of peace, the president sent Greeley himself immediately to meet them and confer on the basis of a restored Union with compensation for the slaves. The conference failed, and Greeley returned from Canada angrier with the president than ever for making a fool of him. In utter disregard for the facts, he continued to demand that the government bring the war to an end. The thing which made his attack deadly was that he was rousing the bitterness of hopeless sorrow in thousands of homes whose loved ones had fallen. Thoughtful men and women had begun to ask themselves the new question: is not the price we are paying too great? Can any cause be worth this ocean of tears, this endless deluge of blood? The president must answer this bitter cry with the positive assurance that he would make peace at any moment on terms consistent with the nation's preservation, or both he and his party must perish. He determined to draw from Mr. Davis a positive declaration of the terms on which the South would accept peace. He dared not do this openly, as it would be a confession to Europe of defeat and would lead to the recognition of the Confederacy. He accordingly sent Colonel Jacques, a distinguished Methodist clergyman in the army, and J.R. Gilmore, the Tribune, on a secret mission to Richmond for this purpose. They must go without credentials or authority as private individuals and risk life and liberty in the undertaking. Both men promptly accepted the mission and left for Grant's headquarters to ask General Lee for a pass through the lines. The Democratic Party was now a militant, united force inspired by the Copperhead leaders, who had determined to defeat the president squarely on a peace platform and put General McClellan into the White House. Behind them, in serried lines, stood the powerful secret order clustered around the Knights of the Golden Circle. Positive proofs were finally laid before the president that these societies had planned an uprising on the night of the election and the establishment of a Western Confederacy. Edmunds, the president of the Union League, handed him the names of the leaders. "Now, sir, you can strike." The tall, sorrowful man slowly shook his head. "You doubt the truth of these statements?" Edmunds asked. "No, they are too true. Let sleeping dogs lie, one revolution at a time. We have all that we can manage at present. If we win the election, they won't dare rise. If we lose, it's all over anyhow, and it makes no difference what they do." With patient wisdom, he refused to stir the dangerous hornet's nest. And to cap the climax of darkness, Jubal Early's army suddenly withdrew from Lee's lines, swept through the Shenandoah Valley, and invaded Maryland and Pennsylvania. With 750,000 blue soldiers under arms, the daring men in gray were once more threatening the capital. They seized and cut the northern railroads, burned their bridges, and capturing trains. They threatened Baltimore, captured Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, burned it, spread terror throughout the state and surrounding territory, and brushing past Lew Wallace's 6,000 men at Monocacy, and were bearing down on Washington with swift, ominous tread. It was incredible, it was unthinkable, and yet the reveille of Early's drums could be heard from the White House window. John Bigelow, our charge d'affaires at Paris, had sent warning of a conversation with the Emperor of France, at which the president had only smiled. "Lee will take Washington," the Emperor had declared, "and then I shall recognize the Confederacy. I have just received news that Lee is certain to take the capital." The message was flashed to Grant for help. The city was practically at Early's mercy if he should strike. He couldn't hold the capital, of course, but if he took it, even for 24 hours, the government would lose all prestige and standing in the courts of Europe. For 24 hours, the panic in Washington was complete. The government clerks were rushed into the trenches and hastily armed. Early threw one shell into the city, which crashed through a house. His cavalry dashed into the corporate limits and took a prisoner, and later burned the house of Blair, a member of the cabinet. The 6th Corps arrived from Petersburg. 1,000 men were killed and wounded in the skirmishing of 2 days, but the capital escaped by the skin of its teeth. Grant laconically remarked, If Early had been 1 day earlier, he would have entered the capital. While he had not actually taken Washington, Lee's strategy was a masterly stroke. He had cleared the Shenandoah Valley, which was his granary, and enabled the farmers to reap their crops. He had shown the world that his army was still so terrible a weapon that with it he could hold Grant at bay, drive his enemy from the valley, invade 2 northern states, burn their cities and destroy their railroads, and throw his shells into Washington. A wave of incredulous, sickening despair swept the North. If this could be done after 3.5 years of blood and tears and $2 billion spent, where could the end be? Early had done in Washington what neither McDowell, McClellan, Pope, Burnside, Hooker, Meade, nor Grant had yet succeeded in doing for Richmond, thrown shells into the city and taken a prisoner from its very streets. Had he arrived a day earlier, in other words, had not Lew Wallace's gallant little army of 6,000 delayed him 24 hours, he could have entered the city, raided the treasury, and burned the Capitol. Senator Winter was not slow to strike the blow for which he had been eagerly waiting a favorable moment. He succeeded in detaching from the president in this moment a panic of a group of men who had stood squarely for his nomination at Baltimore. He agreed to withdraw Fremont's name if they would induce the president to withdraw and a new convention to be called. So deep was the depression, so black the outlook, so certain was McClellan's election, that the members of the National Republican Executive Committee met and conferred with this committee of traitors to their chief. No more cowardly and contemptible proposition was ever submitted to the chosen leader of a great party. It was not to be wondered at that Winter and his radical associates could stoop to it. They were theorists. To them, success was secondary. They would have gladly and joyfully damned not only the Union, they would have damned the world to save their theories. But that his own party leaders should come to him in such an hour cut the great patient heart to the quick. He agreed to consider their humiliating proposition and give them an answer in 2 weeks. Nicolay, his first secretary, wrote to John Hay, who was in Illinois, "Dear Major, hell is to pay. The politicians of a stampede on that is about to swamp everything. The National Committee are here today. Raymond thinks a commission to Richmond is the only salt to save us. The president sees and says it would be utter ruin. The matter is now undergoing consultation. Weak-kneed damned fools are on the move for a new candidate to supplant the president. Everything is darkness and doubt and discouragement. Our men see giants in the airy and unsubstantial shadows of the opposition, and are about to surrender without a blow. Come to Washington on the first train. Every man who loves the chief must lay off his coat now and fight to the last ditch. He's too big and generous to be trusted alone with these wolves. He is the only man who can save this nation, and we must make them see it." Worn and angry after the long discussion with his cowardly advisers, the president retired to his bedroom, locked the door, laid down, and tried to rest. Opposite the lounge on which he lay was a bureau with a swinging mirror. He gazed for a moment at his long figure, which showed full length, his eye resting at last on the deep-cut lines of his haggard face. Gradually, 2 separate and distinct images grew, one behind the other, pale and deathlike, but distinct. He looked in wonder, and the longer he looked, the clearer this pale second reflection. "That's funny," he exclaimed. He rose, rubbed his eyes, and walked to the mirror, examining it curiously. He had always been a man of visions, this child of the woods and open fields. "I wonder if it's an illusion," he muttered. "I'll try again." He returned to the couch and lay down. Again. It grew a second time, plainer than before, if possible. He watched for a long time with a feeling of awe. "Wonder if I'm looking into the face of my own soul," he mused. He studied this second image with keen interest. It was 5 shades paler than the first. The thing had happened to him once before, and his wife had declared it a sign that he would be elected to a second term. But the paleness of the second image meant that he would not live through it. It was uncanny. He rose and paced the floor, laid down again, and the image vanished. What did it mean? Only that day a Secret Service man had come to warn him of a new plot of assassination and beg him to double the guard. "What's the use, my dear boy, in setting up the gap when the fence is down all around? Remember, sir, They shot a hole through your hat one night last week on your way to the soldiers' home. Well, what of it? If a man really makes up his mind to kill me, he can do it. You can take precautions, but I can't shut myself up in an iron box now, can I? If I'm killed, I can die but once. To live in constant dread of it is to die over and over again. I decline to die until the time comes. Away with your extra guards. I've got too many now. They bother me. He threw off his depression and took up a volume of Artemus Ward's funny sayings to refresh his soul with their quaint humor. He must laugh or die. He'd promised to see Betty Winter with a friend who had a petition to present him at 10 o'clock. He would rest until she came. John Vaughan had insisted on her coming at this unusual hour. She protested, but he declared the chances of success in asking for his father's release would be infinitely better if she took advantage of the president's good nature and saw him alone at night, when they would not be interrupted. As they neared the White House grounds, crossing the little park on the north side, Betty's nervousness became unbearable. She stopped and put her hand on John's arms. "Let's wait until tomorrow," she pleaded. "The president's expecting us. I'll send him word that we couldn't come." "But why?" She hesitated and glanced at him uneasily. "I don't know, just nervous. I don't feel equal to the strain of such an interview tonight. It means so much to you. It means so much to me now that love rules my life." He took her hands in his and drew her into the friendly shadows beside the walk. "Love does rule life, doesn't it?" "Absolutely. I'm frightened when I realized it," she sighed. "You're all mine now, in life, in death, through evil report and good report. In life, in death, through evil report and good report. Yours forever, dearest." He took her in his arms and held her in silence. She could feel him trembling with deep emotion. "There's nothing to be nervous about, then," he said reassuringly as his arms relaxed. "Come, we'll hurry. I want to send a message to my father tonight announcing his release." At the entrance to the White House grounds, they passed a man who shot a quick glance at John, and Betty thought his head moved in a nod of approval or recognition. "You know him?" "One of Baker's men, I think. Attempt on the president's life last week. They've doubled the guard, no doubt." He passed another, strolling carelessly from the shadow of the white pillars of the portico. "They seem to be everywhere tonight," John laughed carelessly. The White House door was open, and they passed into the hall and ascended the stairs to the executive chamber without challenge. Little Tad, the president's son, who ran the house to suit himself at times, was in his full dress of a lieutenant of the army and had ordered the guard to attend a minstrel show he was giving in the attic. The president had agreed to meet Betty in his office at 10 o'clock, told her to bring her friend right upstairs and wait if he were not on time. They sat down and waited 5 minutes in awkward silence. Betty was watching the strange glittering expression in John Vaughan's eyes with increasing alarm. She heard a muffled footfall in the hallway, stepped quickly to the door, and saw the man they had passed at the entrance to the grounds. She returned trembling. "The man we passed at the gates is in the hall," she whispered. "What of it?" was the careless answer. "Baker's Secret Service men have come and go when they please here." He paused and glanced at the door. "He has his eyes on us, maybe," he added with a little laugh. He studied Betty's flushed face for a moment, curiously hesitated, as if about to speak, changed his mind, and was silent. He drew his watch from his pocket and looked at it. "I've ordered a carriage to wait for you at the gate at 10:15, he said quickly. "I forgot to tell you." "Why? It may take us longer than half an hour." "That's just it. We may be talking 2 hours. Such things can't be threshed out in a minute. You can introduce me, say a good word, and leave us to fight it out." "I want to stay," she interrupted. "Nonsense, dear. It may take hours. Besides, I may have some things to say to the president, and he has some things to say to me that it were better a sweet girl's ears should not hear." "That's exactly what I wish to prevent, John dear," she pleaded. "You must be careful and say nothing to offend the president. It means too much. We must win. I'll be wise in the choice of words, but you mustn't stay, dear. I'm not a child. I don't need a chaperone, but you may need a friend. He does wield the power of kings, doesn't he? With the tenderness and love of a father, yes. Yet I've wondered," he went on in a curious cold tone, "why he hasn't been killed with the death of one man would end this carnival of murder." "John, how can you say such things?" Betty gasped. "It's true, dear," he answered calmly. "This man's will alone has prevented peace and prevents it now. The soldiers on both sides joke with one another across the picket lines. They get together and play cards at night before the battle begins. Our boys call out, "Get into your holes now, Johnny, we've got to shoot." Left to themselves, the soldiers would end this war in 30 minutes. It's the one man at the top who won't let them. It's hellish, hellish. And you would justify an assassin? Betty asked breathlessly. Who's an assassin, dear? He demanded tensely. The man who wields a knife or the tyrant who calls the fanatic into being, Brutus or Caesar, William Tell or Gessler? Resistance to tyrants is obedience to God. John, how can you say such things? You don't believe in murder. No, he breathed fiercely. I don't now. I used to until I had a revelation. He stopped short as if strangled. Revelation? What do you mean? Betty whispered, watching his every movement with growing terror. He looked at her with eyes glittering. I didn't want to tell you this, he began slowly. I meant to keep the black thing hidden in my own soul. But you'll understand it better if I speak. I killed Ned Vaughn with my own hands. You're mad, Betty shivered. I wish I were. No, I was never so sane before that flash of red from hell showed me the truth, showed me what I was doing. We fought in the darkness of a night attack hand to hand like two maddened beasts. He ran me through with his sword, and I sent the last ball left of my revolver crashing through his breast. In the glare of that shot I saw his face, the face of my brother. I caught him in my arms as he fell and held him while the lifeblood ebbed away through the hole I had torn near his heart. And then I saw what I'd been doing, saw it all as it is. War, brother murdering brother, the shout and the tumult, the drums and bugles, the daring and heroism of it all. Just that and nothing more, brother cutting his brother's throat. His head sank into his hands in a sob that strangled speech. Betty slipped her arm tenderly around his shoulder and stroked the heavy black hair. But you didn't know, dear. You wouldn't have fired that shot if you had. He lifted himself suddenly and recovered his self-control. No, that's just it. I wouldn't have done it had I known, nor would he had he known. But I should have seen before that every torn and mangled body I had counted in the reckoning of the glory of battle was some other man's brother, some other mother's boy. He paused and drew himself suddenly erect. Well, I'm awake now. I know and see things as they are. His hand unconsciously felt for his revolver, and Betty threw her arms around his neck with a smothered cry of horror. Merciful God, John, my darling, you are mad. What are you going to do? Why, nothing, dear, he protested. Nothing. I'm simply going to ask the President, whose power is supreme, to give my father a fair trial, release him. That's all. You needn't stay any longer. The carriage is waiting. I can introduce myself and plead my own cause. If he's the fair, great-hearted man you believe, he'll see that justice is done. You're going to kill the President, Betty gasped. Nonsense. But if I were, what is the death of one man if thousands live? I saw 60,000 men in blue fall in 30 days. 2,000 a day besides those who wore the gray. At Cold Harbor I saw 10,000 of my brethren fall in 20 minutes. Why should you gasp over the idea that one man may die, whose death would stop the slaughter? John, you're mad, she cried, clinging to him desperately. You're mad, I tell you. You've lost your reason. Come with me, dear. Come at once. No, I was never more sane than now, he answered firmly. Then I'll warn the President. He held her with cruel force. You understand that if it's true, my arrest, court-martial, and death will follow? No, I'll warn him not to come. I alone know. She broke his grip on her arm and started toward the door. He lifted his hand in quick, commanding gesture. Wait. My men are in the hall. It's his life or mine now. You can take your choice. The girl's figure suddenly straightened. Take your men out and go with them at once. No. If he does justice, I may spare his life. If he does not, you shall not see him. It's my life or his, I warn you. Then it's yours. I choose my country. She walked with quick, firm steps to the door leading to the family apartment of the President. On the threshold her feet faltered. She grasped the door, facing, turned, and saw him standing with folded arms, watching her, with the eyes of a madman. Her face went white. She lifted her hand to her heart and slowly stumbled back into his arms. God have mercy, she sobbed. I'm just a woman, my love, my darling. I can't kill you. Her arms relaxed, and she would have fallen to the floor had he not caught the fainting form and carried her into the hall. Two men were at his side instantly. "Take Miss Winter downstairs," he whispered. "There's a carriage at the gate. Bring it quietly to the door. One of you take her to the senator's home. The other must return here immediately and wait my orders. There's no guard in this outer hall at night. The one inside's with the boy. Keep out of sight if anyone passes." The men obeyed without a word, and John Vaughn stepped quickly back into the executive office, drew the short curtains across the window, turned the lights on full, examined his revolver, and sat down in careless attitude beside the president's desk. He could hear his heavy step already approaching the door. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 36, The Assassin. John Vaughn's face paled with the sudden realization of the tremendous deed he was about to do. It had seemed the only solution of the nation's life and his own an hour ago. The air of Washington reeked with deadly hatred of the president. Every politician who could not control his big, straightforward, honest mind was his enemy. The gloom which shrouded the country over Grant's losses and the failure of his campaign had sent every hound yelping at his heels in full cry. He spent much of the time in the hospitals visiting and cheering the wounded soldiers. These men were his friends. They believed in his honesty, his gentleness, and his humanity, and yet so deadly had grown the passions of war, and so bitter the madness of political prejudice, that the majority of the wounded men were going to vote against him in the approaching election. An informal vote taken in Carver Hospital had shown the amazing results of 3-1 in favor of McClellan. John Vaughn, in his fevered imagination, had felt that he was rendering a heroic service to the people in removing the one obstacle to peace. The president was the only man who could possibly defeat McClellan and continue the war. He was denounced by the opposition as a usurper, tyrant, and dictator. He was denounced by the thousands of men in his own party as utterly unfit to wield the power he possessed. And yet, as he heard the slow, heavy footfall approaching the door, a moment of agonizing doubt gripped his will and weakened his arm. His eye rested on a worn, thumbed copy of the Bible which lay open on his desk. The man who was not a church member in the loneliness of his awful responsibilities had been searching there for guidance and inspiration. There was a pathos in the thought that found his inner conscience through the mania that possessed him. Well, he'd test him. He would try this tyrant here alone before the judgment bar of his soul, condemn him to death or permit him to live, as he should prove true or false to his mighty trust. His hand touched his revolver again, and he set his square jaws firmly. The tall figure entered and closed the door. A flash of blind rage came from the depths of John Vaughn's dark eyes at the first sight of him. He moved forward a step, and his hand trembled in a desperate, instinctive desire to kill. He was a soldier. His enemy was before him advancing. To kill had become a habit, seemed the one natural thing to do. He stopped with a shock of surprise as the president turned his haggard eye in a dazed way and looked about the room. The light fell full in his face, increasing its ghost-like, pathetic expression. The story of anxiety and suffering was burnt in letters of fire that left his features a wrinkled mask of gray ashes. The drooping eyelids were swollen, and dark bags hung beneath them. The muscles of his massive jaws were flaccid, the lines about his large, expressive mouth terrible in their eloquence. His somber eyes seemed to gaze on the world with the anguish of millions in their depths. For a moment, John Vaughn was held in a spell by the unexpected apparition. "You are alone, sir?" the quiet voice slowly asked. "Yes. I had expected Miss Winter. She came with me and was compelled to leave. Oh, will you pull up a chair?" The tall form dropped wearily at his desk. His voice had a faraway expression in its tones. "And what can I do for you, sir?" he asked. "My name is Vaughn, John Vaughn." The dark head was lifted with interest. "The brother of Ned Vaughn who escaped from prison?" John nodded. "The son of Dr. Richard Vaughn of Palmyra, Missouri?" "Then you're our boys, fighting with Grant's army. Yes, I've heard of you when your brother was in trouble. You've been ill, I see. Wounded, of course." "Yes." The president rose and took his visitor's hand, clasping it with both of his own. "There's nothing I won't do for one of our wounded boys, if I can." "What is it?" "My mother writes to me that my father has been arrested without warrant, is held in prison without bail, and denied the right to trial." He paused and leaned on the desk, trembling with excitement, which had increased as he spoke. I've come to ask you for justice, that he should be confronted by his accusers in open court and given a fair trial. A frown deepened on the shadow in the dark, kindly face. And for what was he arrested? For exercising the right of free speech. In a public address he denounced the war. The president shook his head sorrowfully. You see, my boy, your house is divided against itself, the symbol of the family group of our unhappy country. Of course, I didn't know of his arrest. Such things hurt me, so I refuse to know of them unless I must. They tell me that Seward and Stanton have arrested without warrant 35,000 men. I hope this is an exaggeration. Still, it may be true. He stopped, sighed, and shook his head again. But come now, my son, and put yourself in my place. What can I do? I've armed 2 million men and spent $4 million a day to fight the South because they tried to secede and disrupt the Union. My opponents in the North, taking advantage of our sorrows, harangue the people and elect a hostile legislature in Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois. They're about to pass an ordinance of secession and strike the Union in the back. If secession is wrong in the South, it is surely wrong in the North. Shall I fight secession in the South and merely argue politely with it here? Instead of shooting these men, I've consented to a more merciful thing. I just let Seward and Stanton lock them up until the war is over, and then I'll turn them all loose. Understand, my boy, I don't shirk responsibility. No cabinet or Congress could conduct a successful war. There must be a one-man power. I have been made that power by the people. I am using it reverently but firmly, and I am backed by the prayers, the goodwill, and the confidence of the people, the silent millions whom I don't see but I love and trust. The war is not my choosing. Once begun, it must be fought to the end and the nation saved. I will then be proved that among free men there can be no successful appeal from the ballot to the bullet, and that they who take such appeal are sure to lose their case and pay the cost. To preserve the life of the Constitution, I must strain some of its provisions in time of war. And you will not interfere to give these accused men a trial? John Vaughan interrupted in hard tones. I cannot, my boy. I dare not interfere. The civil law must be suspended temporarily in such cases. I cannot shoot a soldier for desertion and allow the man to go free who, by denouncing the war, causes him to desert. It cuts to the very heart of the nation. It's life that's involved. He rose again and paced the floor, turning back on his visitor in utter unconsciousness of the dangerous glitter in his eyes. He paused, placed his big hand gently on John's arm. I know in doing this, I am wielding a dangerous power, the power of kings, not because I love it, but because I must save my country, and I'm the humblest man who walks God's earth tonight. In spite of his bitterness, the simplicity and honesty of the president found John Vaughan's heart. No vain or cruel or selfish man could talk or feel like that. In the glow of his eager thought, the ashen look of his face disappeared, and it became radiant with warmth and tenderness. In dreamy, passionate tones, he went on, as if talking to convince himself he must not despair. The younger man, for the moment, was swept resistlessly on by the spell of his eloquence. They're always asking of me impossible things. Now that I shall remove Grant from command, I know that his battles have been bloody, yet how else can we win? The gallant, desperate South has only a handful of men, ragged and half-starved, yet they are standing against 1 million, and I have exhaustless millions behind these. With Lee they seem invincible, and every move of his ragged men sends a shiver of horror and of admiration through the North. Yet, if Grant fights on, he must win. He must wear Lee out, and that is the only way we can beat him. Besides, his plan is bigger than a single campaign against Richmond. There's a grim figure at the head of 100,000 men fighting his way inch by inch towards Atlanta. If Sherman should win and take Atlanta, Lee's army will starve, and the end is sure. I can't listen to this clamor. I will not remove Grant, though I have reasons for believing at this moment he may vote for McClellan for president. Don't think, my son, that all this blood and suffering is not mine. It is. Every shell that screams from those big guns crashes through my heart. The groans of the wounded, the sighs of the dying, the tears of the widows and orphans, the sisters and mothers, all blue and gray, they are mine. I see and hear it all, feel and suffer it all. No man who lives today is responsible for this war. I could not have prevented it, nor could Jefferson Davis. We are in the grip of mighty forces sweeping on from the centuries. We are fighting the battle of the ages, but our country's worth it. If we can save it, out of this agony and tears will be born a united people. We have always been cursed with the impossible contradiction of Negro slavery. There's never been a real democracy in the world because there has never been one without the shadow of slavery. We must build here a real government of the people, by the people and for the people. It's not a question merely of the fate of 4 million of black slaves. It's a question of the destiny of millions of freemen. I hear the tread of coming generations of their children on this continent. Their destiny is in your hand and mine. A free nation without a slave, the hope, refuge, and inspiration of the world. This union that we must save will be a beacon light on the shores of time for mankind. It will be worth all the blood and all the tears we shall give for it. The grandeur of our sacrifice will be the birthright of our children's children. It will be the end of sectionalism. We can never again curse and revile one another as we've done in the past. We've written our character in blood for all time. We've met in battle. The northern man knows the southerner is not a braggart. The southerner knows the Yankee is not a coward. There can be but one tragedy, my boy, that can have no ray of light, and that is that all of this blood should have flowed in vain, that all these brave men died for naught. That the old curse shall remain, that the Union shall be dismembered into broken sections, and on future bloody battles, their battles will be fought over again. He paused and drew a deep breath. This is the fear that's strangling me. For as surely as George B. McClellan is elected president surrounded by men who at present control his party, just so surely will the war end in compromise, failure, and hopeless tragedy. Why do you say that? John asked sharply. Because, standing here on this very spot, before the battle of Gettysburg, I offered him the presidency if he would preside at a great mass meeting of his party and guarantee to save the Union. I offered to efface myself and give up the dearest ambition of my soul, to heal the wounds of my people, and he refused. Refused? John gasped. Yes. The younger man gazed at the haggard face for a moment through dimmed eyes, sank slowly to a seat and covered his face in his hands in a cry of despair. The reaction was complete and his collapse utter. The president gazed at the bent figure with sorrowful amazement, touched his hand gently with his big friendly hand. Why, what's the matter, my boy? I'm the only man to despair. You're just a captain in the army. If to be at the head of hell is as hard as what I've had to undergo here, I could find it in my heart to pity Satan himself. And if there's a man out of hell who suffers more than I do, I pity him. But it's my burden, and I try to bear it. I wish I had only yours. John Vaughn sprang from his feet and threw his hands above his head in a gesture of anguish. Oh, my God, you don't understand. He quickly crossed the space that separated them and faced the president with grim determination. But I'm going to tell you the truth now, and you can do what is right. In the last fight before Petersburg, I killed my brother in a night attack and held his dying body in my arm. I think I must have gone mad that night. Anyhow, when I lay in the hospital recovering from my wounds, I got the letter about my father and made up my mind to kill you. He paused, but the somber eyes gave no sign. They seemed to be gazing on the shores of eternity. And I came here tonight for that purpose. My men are in the hall now. He stopped and folded his hand deliberately, waiting for the judge to speak. A long silence fell between them. The tall, sorrowful man was looking at him with a curious expression of wonder and self-pity. So you came here tonight to kill me? Yes. Again a long silence, the deep eyes looking with their strange, questioning glance. Well, the younger man burst out at last, what is my fate? I deserve it. Even generosity and gentleness have their limit. I've passed it, and I've no desire to escape. The kindly hand was lifted to John Vaughn's shoulder. Why didn't you do it? Because for the first time you made me see things inside as you see them. I got a glimpse of the inside. Then I won you, didn't I? The president cried with elation. I've been talking to you just to keep my courage up, just to save my own soul from the hell of despair, but you've lifted me up. If I can win you, I can win all the others. If I could only get into their ear. All I need's a little time, and I'm going to fight for it. Every act of my life in this great office will stand the test of time because I've put my immortal soul in the struggle without one thought of saving myself. I've told you the truth, and the truth has turned a murderer into my friend. If only the people can know, can have time to think, I'll win. You thought me an ambitious tyrant, now didn't you? Yes. Great God, I had my ambitions, yes, as every American boy worth his salt has, and I dared to dream this vision of the White House. I, the humblest of the humble, born in a lowly pioneer's cabin in the woods of Kentucky. My dream came true, and where's its glory? Ashes and blood. And I, to whom the sight of blood is an agony unendurable, have lived with an aching heart through all of it, and envied the dead their rests on your battlefield. He stopped and suddenly fixed John with a keen look. You'll stand by me now, boy, through thick and thin? I'd count it an honor to die for you. All right, I'll give you a chance. I'm going to send you on a dangerous mission. I need but two things to sweep the country in this election. A single big victory in the field to make them see things as they are, and a declaration from Mr. Davis that there can be no peace save in division. I know that he holds that position, but the people in the North doubt it. I've sent Jacques and Gilmore there to obtain his declaration. Technically, they are spies. They may be executed or imprisoned and held to the end of the war. They go as private citizens of the North who desire peace. I want another man in Richmond whose identity will be unknown to report the results of that meeting in case they're imprisoned. You must go as a spy at the double risk of your life. I'm ready, sir, was the quick response. The big hand fumbled the black beard a moment. You doubtless said bitter things in Washington when you returned. Many of them. Then you were approached by the leaders of the Knights of the Golden Circle? Yes. Good. You're the man I want without a doubt. You can use their signs and passwords in Richmond. Besides, you have a southern accent. Your chances of success are great. I want you to leave here in an hour. Go straight through as a scout and spy in the Confederate uniform. If Jacques and Gilmore are allowed to return and tell their story, all right, your work with them is done. If they're imprisoned, get through the line to Grant's headquarters, report this fact and Mr. Davis's answer, and it will be doubly effective. You understand? Perfectly, sir. That's your first job. But I want you to go to Richmond for a double purpose. To take the train for Atlanta. Get through the lines and give a message to a man down south I've been thinking about for the past month. The world's forgotten Sherman in the rear of the great battles Grant has fought. I haven't. Slowly but surely his grim figure has been growing taller on the horizons as the smoke lifts from each of his fights. Grant says he is our biggest general. Only a great man could say that about a subordinate commander. That's another reason I won't listen to the people who demand Grant's removal. Sherman is now 150 miles in Georgia before Atlanta. His road is being cut behind him every other day. You might be weeks trying to get to him by Chattanooga. The trains run through from Richmond. I want you to reach him quick and give him a message from me. I can't send a written order. It wouldn't be fair to Grant. I'll give you credentials that he'll accept that will cost you your life in Richmond if their meaning is discovered. Tell General Sherman that if he can take Atlanta, the blow will thrill the nation, carry the election, and save the Union. Grant is deadlocked at Petersburg and may be there all winter. If he can fight it once and give us a victory, that's all that's needed. I'll send him an order to strike. Tell him to destroy it if he wins. If he loses, I'll publish it and take the blame on myself. Can you do this? I will, or I'll die in the effort, was the quick reply. All right. Take this card at once to Stanton's office. Ask him to send you by vote to Aquia. By horse from there. Return here for your papers. In 10 minutes, John had dispatched a note to Betty. Dearest, God saved me from an act of madness. He sent his message through your sweet spirit. I am leaving for the South on a dangerous mission for the President. If I live to return, I am all yours. If I die, I shall live through eternity if only to love you. John. Within an hour, He had communicated with the commander of the Knights of the Golden Circle. His arrangements were complete, and he was streaming down the river on his perilous journey. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 37, Mr. Davis Speaks. John Vaughan arrived in Richmond a day before Jock and Gilmore. His genial southern manner, his perfect accent, and his possession of the signs and passwords of the Knights of the Golden Circle made his mission a comparatively easy one. He had brought a message from the Washington Knights to Judah P. Benjamin, which won the confidence of Mr. Davis as Secretary of State and gained his ready consent to his presence on the occasion of the interview. The commissioners left Butler's headquarters with some misgivings. Gilmore took the doughty general by the hand and said, "Goodbye. If you don't see us in 10 days, you may know we've gone up." "If I don't see you in less time," he replied, "I'll demand you. And if they don't produce you, I'll take 2 for 1. My hand on that." Under a flag of truce, they found Judge Ould, the exchange commissioner who conducted them into Richmond under cover of darkness. They stopped at the Spotswood House, and the next morning saw Mr. Benjamin, who agreed to arrange an interview with Mr. Jefferson Davis. Mr. Benjamin was polite but inquisitive. "Do you bring any overtures from your government, gentlemen?" "No, sir," answered Colonel Jacques. "We bring no overtures and have no authority from our government. As private citizens, we simply wish to know what terms will be acceptable to Mr. Davis." "Are you acquainted with Mr. Lincoln's views?" "One of us is fully," said Colonel Jacques. "Did Mr. Lincoln in any way authorize you to come here?" "No, sir," said Gilmore. "We came with his pass, but not by his request. We came as men and Christians, not as diplomats, hoping in a frank talk with Mr. Davis to discover some way by which this war may be stopped." "Well, gentlemen," said Benjamin, "I will repeat what you say to the President, and if he follows my advice, he will meet you." At 9 o'clock, the 2 men had entered the State Department and found Jefferson Davis seated at the long table on the right of his Secretary of State. John Vaughan was given a seat at the other end of the table to report the interview for Mr. Benjamin. He studied the distinguished President of the Confederate States with interest. He had never seen him before. His figure was extremely thin, his features typically Southern in their angular cheeks and high cheekbones. His iron-gray hair was long and thick and inclined to curl at the end. His whiskers were small and trimmed farmer fashion on the lower end of his strong chin. The clear gray eyes were full of vitality. His broad forehead, strong mouth, and chin denoted an iron will. He wore a suit of grayish-brown, of foreign manufacture, and as he rose, seemed about 5 feet 10 inches, his shoulders slightly stooped. His manner was easy and graceful, his voice cultured and charming. "I'm glad to see you, gentlemen," he said. "You are very welcome to Richmond." "We thank you, Mr. Davis," Gilmore replied. "Mr. Benjamin tells me that you have asked to see me to—" He paused that the visitors might finish the sentence. "Yes, sir," Jacques answered. "Our people want peace. Your people do. We have come to ask how it may be brought about. Withdraw your armies, let us alone, and peace will come at once. But we cannot let you alone so long as you repudiate the Union. I know. You would deny us what you exact for yourselves, the right of self-government." "Even so," said Colonel Jacques, "we cannot fight forever. The war must end sometime. We finally agree on something. Can we agree now and stop this frightful carnage?" "I wish peace as much as you do," replied Mr. Davis. "I deplore bloodshed, but I feel that not one drop of this blood is on my hands. I can look up to God and say this. I tried all of my power to avert this war. I saw it coming, and for 12 years I worked day and night to prevent it. The North was mad and blind, and would not let us govern ourselves, and now it must go on until the last man of this generation falls in his tracks, and his children seize the musket and fight our battle, unless you acknowledge our right to self-government. We are not fighting for slavery. We are fighting for independence, and that, or our extermination, we will have." "We have no wish to exterminate you," protested the colonel, "but we must crush your armies. Is it not already nearly done? Grant has you shut up in Richmond. Sherman is before Atlanta. You don't seem to understand the situation, Mr. Davis laughed. We're not exactly shut up in Richmond yet. If your papers tell the truth, it is your capital that is in danger, not ours. Lee, who has never been broken, holds Grant in check, and has men enough to spare to invade Maryland and Pennsylvania and threaten Washington. Sherman, to be sure, is for Atlanta. But suppose he is. The further he goes from his base of supplies, the more disastrous defeat must be, and defeat may come. But you cannot expect, Gilmore said, with only 4.5 millions to hold out forever against 20. Mr. Davis smiled. Do you think there are 20 million at the North determined to crush us? I do not so read the returns of your elections or the temper of your people. If I understand you then, Jacques continued, the dispute with your government is narrowed to this, union or disunion, or, in words, independence or subjugation. We will be free. We will govern ourselves. We will do it if we have to see every southern plantation sacked and every southern city in flames. The visitors rose and after a few pleasant remarks took their leave. Mr. Davis was particularly cordial to Colonel Jacques, whom he knew to have been a clergyman. John was surprised to see him repeat the habit of Abraham Lincoln of taking the hand of his visitor in both his in exactly the same cordial way. Had he forgotten for the moment that both Lincoln and Davis were Southerners, born in the same state and reared in precisely the same school of thought and social usage? Colonel, the thin Southerner said in his musical voice, I respect your character and your motives, and I wish you well. Every good wish possible, consistent with the interests of the Confederacy. As they were passing through the door, he added, Say to Mr. Lincoln that I shall at any time be pleased to receive proposals for peace on the basis of our independence. It will be useless to approach me with any other. Next morning, the visitors waited in vain for the appearance of Judge Ould to convey them once more into the Union lines. Visions of a long term in prison, to say nothing of a possible hangman's noose, began to float before their excited fancy. They had expected the judge at 8 o'clock. It was 3 in the afternoon when he entered with the laconic remark, Well, gentlemen, if you are ready, we'll walk around to Libby Prison. Certain of their doom, the two men rose and spoke in concert. We are ready. They followed the judge downstairs and found the same coal-black driver with the rickety team that had brought them into Richmond. Gilmore smiled into the judge's face. Why were you so long in coming? Ould hesitated and laughed. I'll tell you when the war is over. Now I'll take you through the Libby and the hospitals if you'd like to go. When they had visited the prison and the hospitals, Gilmore again turned to the judge. Now explain to us, please, your delay this morning. We're curious. Ould smiled. I suppose I'd as well tell you. When I called on Mr. Davis for your permit, Mr. Benjamin was there impressing on the President of the Confederate States the absolute necessity of placing you two gentlemen in Castle Thunder until the northern elections are over. Mr. Benjamin is a very eloquent advocate. Mr. Davis hesitated. I took issue with the Secretary of State, and we had a very exciting argument. The President finally reserved decision until 2 o'clock and asked me to call and get it. He handed me your pass with this remark. It's probably a bad business for us, but it would alienate many of our northern friends if we should hold on to these gentlemen. In 2 hours, the visitors had reached the Union lines. John Vaughn had obtained his passes and was on his way to Atlanta. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 38, The Stolen March. John Vaughn's entrance into Atlanta was simple. His credentials from Richmond were perfect. His exit proved to be a supreme test of his nerve. The two lines of siege and battle stretched in wide semicircle for miles over the ragged wood-tangled hills about the little gate city of the South. Sherman had fought his way from Chattanooga 150 miles since May with consummate skill. His march had been practically a continuous series of battles, and yet his losses had been small compared to General Grant's. In killed, wounded, and prisoners, he had only lost 32,000 men in 4 months. The Confederate losses had been greater, at least 35,000. Hood, The new Southern commander had given him battle a month before and had suffered an overwhelming defeat, losing 8,000 men, Sherman but 3,700. The Confederate forces had retired behind the impregnable fortifications of Atlanta, and Sherman lay behind his trenches, waiting in grim silence. The pickets at many places were so close together they could talk. John Vaughn attempted to slip through at night, while they were chafing one another. He lay for an hour in the woods, near the Southern picket line, watching his chance. The men were talking continuously. "Why the devil don't you all fight?" a gray man called. "Uncle Billy says it's cheaper to flank you and make you Johnnies run to catch up with us." "Yeah, damn you. And we've got you right now where we want you. We can't do no more flanking. You got to fight." "Trust Uncle Billy for that when the time comes." "Yeah. We've got Billy Sherman where we want him now. We're going to blow up every bridge behind you, and you'll never see home no more." "Uncle Billy's got duplicates of all your bridges, fast as you blow 'em up." "All right. We're going to blow up the tunnels through the mountains." "That's nothing. We've got duplicates of all those tunnels, too." John Vaughn began to creep toward the Federal lines, and muskets blazed on both sides. He dropped flat on the ground, and it took 2 hours to crawl to a place of safety. He felt these lines next morning when they were wider apart, and found them too dangerous to attempt. The pickets, at the point he approached, were in an ugly mood, and desultory fire was kept up all day. The men had bunched up together, and trenched themselves, keeping a deadly watch for the men in blue. He stood a half an hour close enough to see every movement of two young pickets who evidently had some score to pay and were hunting for their foe with quiet, deadly purpose. "There's a Yank behind that clump," said one. "Nah, nothing but a huckleberry bush," the other replied. "Yeah, there is two. We'll decoy and pot him. I'll get ready now, and you raise your cap on the ramrod above the hole. He'll lift his head to fire, and I'll get him." The speaker cautiously slipped his musket in place and drew a bead on the spot. His partner placed his hat on his ramrod and slowly lifted it a foot above their hiding place. The hat had scarcely cleared the pile of dirt before the musket flashed. "Got him. I told you he was there." John turned from the scene with a sense of sickening horror. He would die for his country, but he hoped he would not be called on to kill again. He made a wide detour and attempted to cross the lines 5 miles further from the city, and walked suddenly into a squad of gray soldiers in command of a lieutenant. The officer eyed him with suspicion. "What's your business here, sir?" he asked sharply. "Looking over the lines," John replied casually. "So I see." "That's why I asked you. Show your pass." "Why, I haven't one." "I thought not. You're a damn spy, and you'd just as well say your prayers. I'm going to hang you." The men pressed near. Among them was a second lieutenant, a big, strapping, quiet-looking fellow. "You made a mistake, gentlemen," John protested. "I'm a newspaper man from Atlanta. The chief sent me out to look over the lines and report." "It's a lie. We've forbidden every paper in town to dare such a thing." John smiled. "That's just why my office sent me, I reckon." "Well, he sent you once too often." He turned to his orderly. "Get me a bridle rein off my horse." In vain John protested. The commander shook his head. "It's no use talking. You've passed the deadline here today. This is a favorite spot for scouts to cross. I'm not going to take any chances. I'm going to hang you." "Why don't you search me first?" He was sure that his dangerous message was so skillfully sewed in the soles of his shoes that he would not be discovered. "I could search you afterwards," was the laconic reply. He quickly tied the leather strap around his neck and threw the end of it over a limb. The touch of his hand and the rough way in which he had tied the leather stirred John Vaughn's rage to boiling point. All sense of danger was lost for the moment in blind anger. He turned suddenly and faced his executioner. "This is a damned outrage, sir. Even a spy is entitled to a trial by a drumhead court-martial." "Yeah, that's what I say," the big quiet fellow broke in. "I'm in command of this squad," thundered the lieutenant. "I know you are," was the cool answer. "That's why this outrage is going to be committed." The executioner dropped the rein and faced his subordinate. "You're going to question my authority? I've already done it, haven't I?" A quick blow followed. The quiet man in response knocked his commander down, and the men sprang on them as they drew their revolvers. John Vaughn, with a sudden leap, reached the dense woods and in 5 minutes was inside Sherman's lines. The bridle rein was still around his neck, and the blue picket helped him untie the ugly knot. "Had a close call," he panted, with a glance toward the woods. "You look it, partner. You'll be wanting to see General Sherman, I guess." "Yes, to headquarters quick. Can't get there too quick enough to suit me." He had recovered his composure before reaching the farmhouse where General Sherman and his staff were quartered. The day was one of terrific heat, the 1st of September. The President's description of the famous fighter and tremendous responsibility, which was now being placed on his shoulders, had roused John's curiosity to the highest pitch. The general was seated in an armchair in the yard under a great oak. His coat was unbuttoned, and he had tilted back against the tree in a comfortable position, reading a newspaper. His black slouch hat was pulled far down over his face. John saluted. "This is General Sherman?" "Yes," was the quick, pleasant answer. As the tall, gaunt form slowly rose, John noted his striking and powerful personality. The large frame, restless hazel eyes, firm aquiline nose, bronze features, and cropped beard. His every movement was instinct with the power of perfect physical manhood. 44 years old, the incarnation of health and wiry strength. "I come from Washington, General," John continued, "and bear a special message from the President." "From the President? Oh, come inside, then." The tall figure moved with quick, nervous energy. In 10 minutes, couriers were dashing from his headquarters in every direction. At 1 o'clock that night, the big movement of his withdrawal from the siege lines began. He had no intention of hurling his men against those deadly trenches. He believed that with a sure, swift start, undiscovered by the Confederates, he could by a single battle turn their lines at Jonesboro, destroy the railroad, and force General Hood to evacuate Atlanta. His sleeping men were carefully waked. Not a single note from bugle or drum sounded. The wheels of the artillery and wagons were wrapped with cloth, and every sound muffled. Through pitch darkness and dead silence, the men were swung into marching lines. The moving columns could be felt but not seen. Every soldier followed blindly the man before. Somewhere in the black night there must be a leader, God knows. They didn't. They walked by faith. The wet ground, soaked by recent rains, made their exit easier. The sound of horses' hooves and the tramping thousands could scarcely be heard. The ranks were strung out in long, ragged lines, each man going as he pleased. Something blocked the way ahead, and the columns butted into one another and pinched the heels of the men in front. In their anger, the fellows smarting with pain forgot the orders for silence. A storm of low muttering and grumbling rumbled through the darkness. "What the hell here? What's the matter with you? Keep off my heels! What the hell are you running over me for? Hold up your damn gun! Keep it out of my eye, won't you? Damn your eye!" He started again and run into a bog of mud knee-deep, cut into mush by the artillery and wagons which must have passed on. The first men in line were in to their knees and stuck fast before they could stop the lines surging in the dark. They collided with the bogged ones and fall over them. The ranks behind stumble in on top of the fallen before word can be passed to halt. The night reeks with oaths. The patient heavens reverberate with them. The mud-soaked soldiers, damned with equal unction, all things visible and invisible on earth and above it. They curse the United States of America, and they damn the Confederate States with equal emphasis, and wish them both at the bottom of the lowest depths of the deepest pit of perdition. As one fellow blew the mud from his mouth and nose, he bawled, "I wish Sherman and Hood were both in hell this minute." "Yes, and fighting it out to suit themselves," his comrade answered. On through the black night, the long blue lines crept under lowering skies toward the foe, the stern face of William Tecumseh Sherman grimly set on his desperate purpose. End of Chapter 38. Chapter 39 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 39, Victory. Betty Winter found the President at the War Telegraph Office in the old Army and Navy building. He was seated at the desk by the window where in 1862 he had written his first draft of his Emancipation Proclamation on pieces of pasteboard. "You have heard nothing yet from General Sherman?" she asked pathetically. "Nothing, child." "And no message of any kind from John Vaughan since he left?" she exclaimed hopelessly. "But I'm sure, remember, to a moral certainty, that he reached Richmond safely and left there safely." "How do you know?" "Gilmore has just arrived with his reply from Jefferson Davis. It will be worth 500,000 votes for us. From his description of the reporter with Benjamin, I'm sure it was our messenger." "But you don't know, Betty sighed. The President bent and touched her shoulder gently. "Come, dear, it's not like you to despair." The girl smiled wanly. "How long since any message arrived from General Sherman?" 3 days, my child. I know the hole he went in at, but I can't tell where he's going to come out. If he ever comes out, Betty broke in bitterly. Oh, he'll come out somewhere. It's a habit of his. I've watched him for months. Sometimes I can't hear from him for a week, but he always bobs up again and comes out with a whoop, too. But we've no news. No news has always been good news from Sherman. He paused and looked at his watch. Wait here. I'll be back in a few moments. We're bound to hear something today. I have an engagement with my committee of undertakers. They are waiting for me to deliver my corpse to them, and they are very restless about it because I haven't given up sooner. I'm full of foolish hopes. I'm going to adjourn them until we can get a message of some kind. He returned in half an hour and sat in silence for a long time, listening to the steady, sharp click of the telegraph keys. Betty was too blue to talk, too heartsick to move. At last the tall figure rose and walked back among the operators. They knew that he was waiting for the magic call, Atlanta, Georgia. It had been 3 years and more since that heading for a message had flashed over their wires. Every ear was keen to catch it. The president bent over the table of Southern wires and silently watched. You can't strain a little message through for me, can you, my boy? The operator smiled. I wish you could, sir. The president returned to the front room and shook his head to Betty. Nothing. He entered Atlanta's spy, didn't he? She said despairingly. Yes, of course. They couldn't execute him without our knowing it, could they? If they trap him, yes. But he's a very intelligent young man. He'll be too smart for him. I feel it. I know it. He stopped and looked at her quizzically. I've sort of a second sight that tells me such things. I saw General Sickles in the hospital after Gettysburg. They said he couldn't live. I told him he would get well, and he did. Again the president returned restlessly to the operator's room, and Betty followed him to the door. He waited a long time in silence, shook his head, and turned away. He had almost reached the door, when suddenly the operator sprang to his feet, livid with excitement. Wait, Mr. President, it's come. My God, it's here. Every operator was on his feet, listening in breathless excitement to the click of that Southern wire. The president rushed back to the table. It's for you, sir. Read it, then. Out with it. You take it. Atlanta, Georgia, September 3rd, 1864. Glory to God, the president shouted. Atlanta's ours and fairly won. W.T. Sherman. O my soul, lift up thy head, the sorrowful lips shouted. Unto thee, O God, we give all the praise now and forevermore. He seated himself and quickly wrote his thanks and congratulations. Executive Mansion, Washington, D.C., September 3rd, 1864. The national thanks are rendered by the President to Major General W.T. Sherman and his gallant officers and soldiers of his command before Atlanta for the distinguished ability and perseverance displayed in the campaign in Georgia, which under divine favor has resulted in the capture of Atlanta. The marches, battles, and sieges that have signalized this campaign must render it famous in the annals of war, and have entitled you to the applause and thanks of the nation. Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States. His somber eyes flamed with a new light. He took the copy of his message from Sherman and started to the White House with long, swift strides. Betty greeted him outside with tearful joy, still mixed with deep anxiety. You have no word from him, of course? Not yet, child, but it will come. Cheer up. Sure to come. You see that he reached Atlanta and delivered my message. We are not sure. The city may have fallen anyhow. Yes, but it didn't just fall anyhow. Sherman took it. He got my message, I know it. I felt it flash through the air from his soul to mine. His faith and enthusiasm were contagious, and Betty returned home with new hope. In half an hour, the committee, who were waiting for his resignation from the National Republican ticket, filed into his office to receive, as they supposed, his final surrender. The chairman rose with doleful countenance. Since leaving you, Mr. President, we have just heard a most painful and startling announcement from the War Department. We begged you to withhold the new draft for 500,000 men until after the election. Halleck informs us of the discovery of a great combination to resist it by armed force. General Grant must detach a part of his army from Lee's front in order to put down this counter-revolution. This is the blackest news yet. We trust that you realize the impossibility of your administration asking for endorsement at the polls. With a sign of final resignation, he sat down, and the tall, dark figure rose with quick, nervous energy. I, too, have received important news since I saw you an hour ago. He held his telegram above his head. I'll read it to you without my glasses. I know it by heart. I've just learned that my administration will be endorsed by an overwhelming majority, that the defeat of George B. McClellan and his platform of failures is certainty. The war to preserve the Union's a success. The sword has been driven into the heart of the Confederacy. Sherman has captured Atlanta. The Union is saved. The committee leaped to their feet with a shout of applause and crowded around him to congratulate and praise the man they came to bury. There was no longer a question of his resignation. The fall of Atlanta would thrill the North. A wave of wild enthusiasm would sweep into the sea the last trace of gloom and despair. They were practical men, else, as rats, they would never have tried to desert their own ship. They knew that the tide was going to turn, but it was a swift tide that could turn before they could. They wrung the president's hand. They shouted his praise. They had always gloried in his administration, but foolish grumblers hadn't been able to see things as they saw them, hence this hue and cry. They congratulated him on his certain triumph, and the president watched them go with a quick smile. He was too big to cherish resentments. He only pitied small men. He never hated them. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 40, With Malice Toward None. General Grant fired a salute in honor of the Atlanta victory with shotted guns from every battery on his siege line of 37 miles before Richmond and Petersburg. To Sherman he sent a remarkable message, the kind which great men know how to pen. You have accomplished the most gigantic undertaking given to any general in this war, with a skill and ability which will be acknowledged in history as unsurpassed if not unequaled. From the depths of despair the North swung to the wildest enthusiasm, and in the election which followed, Abraham Lincoln was swept into power again on a tidal wave. He received in round number 2,500,000 votes, McClellan 2 million. His majority by states in the Electoral College was overwhelming, 212 to his opponent's 21. The closing words of his second inaugural rang clear and quivering with emotion over the vast crowd. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. As the last echo died away among the marble pillars above, the sun burst through the clouds and flooded the scene. A mighty cheer swept the throng, and the guns boomed their second salute. The war was closing in lasting peace, and the sun shining on the finished dome of the capital of a new nation. Betty Winter, leaning on John Vaughan's arm, was among the first to grasp the big outstretched hand. "A glorious day for us, sir," she cried, "a proud one for you." With a faraway look, the president slowly answered, "And all that I am in this world, Miss Betty, I owe to a woman, my angel mother. Blessings on her memory." "I trust her spirit heard that beautiful speech," the girl responded tenderly. She paused, looked up at John, blushed, and added, "We are to be married next week, Mr. President." "Is that so?" he said joyfully. "I wish I could be there, my children, but I'm afraid old Grizzly might bite me. So I'll say it now. God bless you." He took their hands in his and pressed them heartily. His eyes suddenly rested on a shining black face grinning behind John Vaughan. My, can this be Julius Caesar Thornton?" He laughed. "Yassa," the black man grinned. "Yes, me, old reliable, sir, right here. I's gonna cook for 'em." From the moment of Abraham Lincoln's election, the end of the war with a restored Union was a foregone conclusion. In the fall of Atlanta, the heart of the Confederacy was pierced, and it ceased to beat. Lee's army, cut off from their supplies, slowly but surely began to starve behind their impregnable breastworks. Sherman's march to the sea and through the Carolinas was merely a torchlight parade. The fighting was done. When Lee's emaciated men, living on a handful of parched corn a day, staggered out of their trenches in the spring and tried to join Johnston's army, they marched a few miles to Appomattox, dropping from exhaustion, and surrendered. When the news of this tremendous event reached Washington, the cabinet was in session. Led by the president in silence and tears, they fell on their knees in a prayer of solemn thanks to Almighty God. General Grant won the gratitude of the South by his generous treatment of Lee and his ragged men. He had received instructions from the loving heart in the White House. Long before the surrender in April 1865, the end was sure. The president, knowing this, proposed his cabinet to give the South $400 million, the cost of the war, for 100 days in payment for their slaves, if they would lay down their arms at once. His ministers unanimously voted against his offer, and he sadly withdrew it. Among all his counselors, there was not one whose soul was big enough to understand the far-seeing wisdom of his generous plan. He would heal at once one of the nation's ugliest wounds by soothing the bitterness of defeat. He knew that despair would send the older men of the South to their graves. Edmund Ruffin, who had fired the first shot against Sumter and returned to his Virginia farm when his state seceded, was a type of these ruined, desperate men. On the day that Lee surrendered, he placed the muzzle of his gun into his mouth, pulled the trigger with his foot, and blew his own head into fragments. When Senator Winter demanded proscription and vengeance against the leaders of the Confederacy, the president shook his head. No. Let down the bars. Let 'em all go. Scare them off. He threw up his big hands in a vivid gesture as if he were shooing a flock of troublesome sheep out of his garden. Triumphant now, you will receive our enemies with open arms, the senator sneered. Enemies? There are no such things. The southern states have never really been out of the Union. Their acts of secession were null and void. They know now that the issue's forever settled. The restored Union will be a real one. The Southern people at heart are law-abiding. It was their reverence for the letter of the old law which led them to ignore progress and claim the right to secede under the Constitution. They will be true to Lee's pledge of surrender. I'm going to trust them as my brethren. Let us fold up our banners now and smelt the guns. Love rules. Let her mightier purpose run. So big and generous, so broad and statesmanlike was his spirit, that in this hour of victory his personality became in a day the soul of the new republic. The South had already unconsciously grown to respect the man who had loved yet fought her for what he believed to be her highest good. He was entering now a new phase of power. His influence over the people was supreme. No man or set of men in Congress or outside of it could defeat his policies. Even through the years of stunning defeats and measureless despair, his enemies had never successfully opposed a measure on which he had set his heart. His first great work accomplished in destroying slavery and restoring the Union, there remained but two tasks on which his soul was set: to heal the bitterness of the war and remove the Negro race from physical contact with the white. He at once addressed himself to this work with enthusiasm. That he could do it, he never doubted for a moment. His first care was to remove the Negro soldiers from the country as quickly as possible. He summoned General Butler and set him to work on his scheme to use these 180,000 black troops to dig the Panama Canal. He summoned Bradley, the Vermont contractor, and put him to work on estimates for moving the Negroes by ship to Africa or by train to an undeveloped Western territory. His prophetic soul had pierced the future and had seen with remorseless logic that two such races as the Negro and Caucasian could not live side by side in a free democracy. The radical theorists of Congress were demanding that these black men, emerging from 4,000 years of slavery and savagery, should receive the ballot and the right to claim the white man's daughter in marriage. They could only pass these measures over the dead body of Abraham Lincoln. The assassin came at last, a vain, foolish dreamer who had long breathed the poisoned air of hatred. It needed but the flash of this madman's pistol on the night of the 14th of April to reveal the grandeur of Lincoln's character, the marvel of his patience, and his wisdom. The curtains of the box at Ford's Theater were softly drawn apart by an unseen hand. The angel of death entered, paused at the sight of the smile on his rugged, kindly face, touched the drooping shoulders, called him to take the place he had won among earth's immortals, and left to us the gentlest memory of our world. The end. So ends the reading of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Copyright 1913. This book is in the public domain.